I am Zora, 35 years old, and at my grandmother's funeral, she left me nothing but a weathered savings book. My father snatched it directly from my hands and tossed it straight into her open grave, telling me to let it stay buried. I climbed down into the mud to take it back. When I brought it to the bank the next morning, the teller's face lost all its color. She locked her terminal hit a silent alarm and whispered that I needed to stay exactly where I was because she was calling the police. Before I reveal what happened next, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to fight your own family for the respect you deserve. The stifling humidity of an Atlanta summer pressed down on the cemetery, thick and unforgiving. We were standing around the gaping hole in the earth, the red Georgia clay piled high next to the mahogany casket holding Grandma Ruby. She was the matriarch of our family, the woman who had scrubbed floors and saved every dime to build the foundation of the wealth my father now paraded around as his own. But there was no solemn respect at this graveside. There was only the suffocating weight of my family's relentless judgment. The pastor had just finished his final prayer when the estate attorney handed me a small battered leather savings book. It was the only item Grandma Ruby had explicitly left to me in her final directives. I had barely run my fingers over the cracked binding when my father Desmond stepped forward and ripped it from my grasp. "You have been a parasitic embarrassment since you dropped out of law school to count pennies for a living." Desmond sneered, his voice a low, venomous hiss that cut through the humid air. He held the little book up as if it were a piece of garbage. "That senile old woman's junk is useless. Let it stay buried just like your career." With a flick of his wrist, he tossed the savings book straight into the open grave. It hit the polished wood of the casket with a hollow thud and slid down into the damp red mud. My mother Vivian immediately stepped up beside him, adjusting the brim of her wide black designer hat. She cast an anxious glance toward the crowd of prominent church elders and local politicians who had gathered to pay their respects to the great Desmond's mother. For Vivian, everything was a performance, a carefully curated display of elite black excellence that I constantly threatened simply by existing. "Stop making a scene, Zora," my mother whispered harshly, grabbing my sister Chloe's arm and pulling her back as if my very presence was contagious. "You are ruining a perfectly good morning sequence. Do you want the entire congregation to see us bickering like commoners? We have a reputation to uphold." Chloe, the undisputed golden child of the family, simply rolled her eyes. At 32, she was poised to take over our father's massive real estate and logistics empire. She stood there in her impeccably tailored dress, radiating the unearned arrogance of someone who had never heard the word no. Beside her stood her husband, Preston. He was a white corporate lawyer whose primary talent seemed to be finding new ways to talk down to me at family gatherings. Preston let out a loud theatrical sigh, checking the time on his heavy silver watch. "Just leave it down there, Zora," Preston said, offering me a condescending smile that made my skin crawl. "Your father is right. You do not understand how these estate things work. It is probably just an old ledger full of expired coupons. You do not need to humiliate yourself any further over literal dirt." They all looked at me with that same familiar mixture of pity and disgust. They saw me exactly the way they had painted me for the last decade, the wayward daughter, the failure who rejected the family business, the glorified bookkeeper who barely scraped by. They had no idea that the custom black suit I was wearing cost more than Preston's entire legal retainer for the month. They had no idea that dropping out of law school was the best decision I ever made, because it allowed me to build my own highly successful forensic accounting firm. I did not count pennies. I tracked missing millions, untangled corporate fraud, and dismantled financial lies for a living. I was completely self-made, but my family preferred their fictional version of my life because it made their inherited success feel earned. I looked from my father's smug face to my mother's embarrassed scowl, to Chloe's bored expression, and finally to Preston's arrogant smirk. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice. I simply turned away from them and stepped directly down into the muddy grave. Gasps rippled through the crowd of mourners. I heard Vivian let out a sharp, scandalized cry, but I tuned out the noise. The wet Georgia clay sucked at my expensive Italian leather shoes, ruining them instantly, but I did not care. I bent down my knees, pressing into the damp earth, and reached past the edge of the mahogany casket. My fingers closed around the rough leather of Grandma Ruby's savings book. When I climbed back up onto the grass, my shoes and the hem of my trousers were caked in thick red mud. The church choir members were whispering furiously behind their programs. My father looked as though he might strike me. His jaw clenched so tight the veins in his neck were bulging. I took a handkerchief from my pocket, carefully wiped the dirt from the cover of the book, and looked my father dead in the eye. "Grandma Ruby built this family before you stole the credit, Dad," I said, my voice projecting clear and steady across the silent cemetery. "I am keeping it." Desmond stepped toward me, his fists balled at his sides. "You are a disgrace to this family name," he spat. "Do not bother coming to the reception. You are not welcome in my house." "I would not dream of stepping foot in your house," I replied smoothly. "Enjoy your performance." I turned my back on the entire assembly and walked away. I could feel hundreds of eyes boring into my back, judging me, pitying me, dismissing me. I kept my posture perfectly straight, carrying the ruined shoes and the muddy hem with the dignity of a queen leaving a court of jesters. The heavy, humid air felt easier to breathe the further I got from my family. By the time I reached the parking lot and slid into the driver's seat of my car, the silence of the enclosed space felt like a protective embrace. I sat there for a long time, listening to the rhythmic hum of the engine, letting the adrenaline slowly drain from my system. My family had always been ruthless, but today felt different. There was a specific kind of panic in my father's eyes when the attorney handed me that book. It was not just his usual disdain for me. It was fear. A man like Desmond did not react with that level of explosive anger over a simple, worthless, sentimental keepsake. I placed the worn leather book on the passenger seat and stared at it. The cover was blank save for a few faded gold ridges along the spine. It looked incredibly ordinary, exactly like the kind of passbook an elderly woman might use to keep track of a modest pension. But Grandma Ruby was not an ordinary woman. She was sharp, observant, and deeply aware of everything that happened in the shadows of my father's business empire. She used to sit on the porch watching the delivery trucks come and go, taking quiet notes on scraps of paper that she always burned before dinner. I picked the book back up, running my thumb along the cracked binding. I opened the front cover. The first few pages were exactly what Preston had predicted: mundane entries of deposits and withdrawals from decades ago, amounts of $20 here, $50 there. But as I flipped further into the book, the handwriting changed. The messy, slanted script of my grandmother's grocery lists gave way to a precise, sharp sequence of alphanumeric codes. My breath caught in my throat. I was a forensic accountant. I spent my days staring at financial data, looking for anomalies and hidden patterns. I recognized immediately what I was looking at. These were not random numbers. I traced my finger over a string of digits on page 40. It was a routing sequence, but not for a local bank. The prefix indicated an offshore financial institution, the kind used exclusively for high-level, untraceable wealth management. Beneath that was a series of encrypted transaction dates and massive monetary figures. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions. My mind raced. How did a retired school teacher have access to offshore routing numbers? Why were these figures written in her personal savings book? I turned to the very last page of the book. The thick paper was slightly warped, as if it had been exposed to moisture and dried over time. Taped to the inside of the back cover with heavy-duty adhesive was a small flat object wrapped in wax paper. I peeled the tape away, my pulse quickening. It was a key. But it was not an old rusted key for a diary or a wooden chest. It was a modern laser-cut safety deposit key. I held it up to the light streaming through my windshield. Engraved on the side of the metal was a distinct serial code and a very specific crest. I knew that crest. Every financial investigator in Atlanta knew that crest. It belonged to the most exclusive private wealth management bank in the city center, a financial fortress that required a minimum deposit of $10 million just to open a basic checking account. It was a bank built for politicians, corporate titans, and people who needed their money to disappear completely. My father banked there. I looked from the laser-cut key to the offshore routing numbers meticulously recorded in my grandmother's handwriting. The narrative my family had maintained for 30 years began to fracture right in front of me. Desmond was not a self-made genius. Vivian's country club lifestyle was not funded by honest logistics contracts. Chloe and Preston were not inheriting a clean, respectable corporate empire. Grandma Ruby had known everything, and for some reason she had bypassed the golden child, bypassed the corporate lawyer's son-in-law, and bypassed her own son to hand the entire puzzle directly to the one person in the family trained to tear financial lies apart. I gripped the steering wheel, a slow, determined calm washing over me. They wanted to treat me like a parasitic embarrassment. They wanted to bury my grandmother's legacy in the mud. I put the car in gear and pulled out of the cemetery, leaving my family behind. I was going to follow the money, and I was going to burn their fake empire to the ground. I parked my car in the driveway of my historic Atlanta brownstone, my hands gripping the steering wheel for a long second before I finally killed the engine. The silence inside the cabin was a sharp contrast to the chaotic spectacle at the cemetery. Stepping out into the thick, suffocating evening heat, I unlocked my heavy oak front door and stepped inside, instantly enveloped by the cool, air-conditioned air of my home. My family loved to circulate the rumor that I lived in a dilapidated, roach-infested rental on the wrong side of the city. They desperately needed the narrative that my refusal to join my father's corrupt logistics empire had condemned me to financial ruin. The reality was that my independent forensic accounting firm had purchased this 3-story property in cash 2 years ago. I had spent months restoring the original hardwood floors, exposing the brick walls, and outfitting the space with sleek, modern security. It was a fortress built entirely on my own merit, completely untainted by Desmond's dirty money. Before I could even kick off my mud-caked designer heels, my phone vibrated furiously against my thigh. I pulled it out to see Chloe's name flashing across the screen. I swiped to answer, pressing the phone to my ear as I walked toward the kitchen. "Are you completely out of your mind?" "Zora," Chloe shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly in the quiet hallway. "Do you have any idea what you just did? You humiliated Dad in front of the entire congregation. You embarrassed Preston in front of his high-level corporate partners." I set Grandma Ruby's weathered leather savings book gently on the pristine white marble of my kitchen island. I poured myself a glass of iced water, taking a slow sip. I retrieved my own property, Chloe. Nothing more. "Property." Chloe scoffed the word, dripping with decades of unearned arrogance. "It is a piece of trash from a woman whose mind was gone. You stood in the mud like a feral animal while the pastor was trying to deliver a respectful benediction. You are a broke, ungrateful scapegoat, Zora. You always have been. You rejected everything Dad built because you were too weak to handle the pressure of real wealth, and now you want to show up and play the grieving granddaughter over a worthless pile of paper." Preston's voice drifted through the background of the call, muffled but distinctly condescending, telling Chloe to remind me that they could easily press charges for disrupting a private ceremony. "Tell your husband that if he wants to threaten me with legal action, he needs to bill me for his hourly rate first," I said, keeping my tone deadly calm. "And Chloe, the next time you want to lecture me about gratitude, remember whose credit card paid for your first semester of college when Dad temporarily cut you off for wrecking his luxury SUV. I hung up the phone before she could draw a breath to scream again. I tossed the device onto the counter, immediately silencing the incoming barrage of text messages that followed. I did not have the time or the emotional bandwidth to entertain my sister's delusions of grandeur. I had work to do. I pulled out one of the heavy velvet bar stools and sat down at the kitchen island, pulling the leather savings book toward me. The scent of old paper and dried lavender wafted up a smell so distinctly Grandma Ruby that my chest tightened with a sudden sharp pang of grief. I pushed the emotion aside immediately. Sentimentality would cloud my judgment, and right now I needed my forensic accounting brain firing on all cylinders. I booted up my secure laptop and connected my portable dual monitors, transforming my kitchen counter into a high-level data analysis hub. I opened the book to the first page. At a glance, it looked exactly like what my father claimed it was. The faded ink detailed mundane deposits from decades ago: $15 for church tithes, $40 for groceries, a recipe for peach cobbler scrawled hastily in the margins. It was the financial diary of a retired schoolteacher living on a fixed income. But Grandma Ruby was the most observant woman I had ever known. She had watched Desmond build his real estate and logistics empire from the ground up, and she had never once praised him for it. While my mother Vivian flaunted her country club memberships and hosted lavish church luncheons, Grandma Ruby had sat quietly in the corner, her eyes sharp, her mouth firmly closed. I turned the brittle pages carefully. Around page 40, the handwriting shifted abruptly. The slanted, casual script transformed into rigid, precise block lettering. The grocery lists vanished entirely, replaced by structured columns of alphanumeric sequences. I dragged my reading glasses down from the top of my head and leaned closer to the pages. My fingers traced a sequence of 14 digits. This was not a standard domestic bank account number. I typed the sequence into my secure terminal and ran it through a basic routing identifier program. The system pinged back immediately. The prefix belonged to an offshore financial institution based in the Cayman Islands. I typed in the next sequence, Cyprus, the next one, Switzerland. My heart began to beat a steady, heavy rhythm against my ribs. These were not random numbers copied from a television screen. These were highly sophisticated, encrypted routing nodes used exclusively for moving massive amounts of untraceable capital across international borders. Beside each routing number were dates and monetary figures that made absolutely no sense for a woman who clipped coupons until her dying day. $250,000 transferred on a Tuesday in November. $500,000 moved on a Sunday in March. I flipped frantically toward the back of the ledger, my eyes scanning the staggering sums. Millions of dollars were meticulously cataloged in this tiny, unassuming book. I reached the final page, noting how the heavy paper was slightly warped and stiff, as if it had been exposed to moisture and dried over time. Taped firmly to the inside cover with heavy-duty adhesive was a small object wrapped tightly in opaque wax paper. I carefully peeled away the tape, unwrapping the paper, to reveal a heavy metallic key. It was perfectly flat, laser-cut with intricate geometric grooves running down the center. This was not a key to a diary, a vintage jewelry box, or a rusty padlock in an attic. It was a modern piece of high-level security hardware. I picked up the key, turning it over under the bright kitchen pendant lights. Engraved on the back of the metal was a distinct, heavily stylized crest depicting a shield over a vaulted gate. Beneath the crest was a 10-digit alphanumeric serial number. A cold chill washed over my skin despite the warmth of the Atlanta evening. In my line of work, I tracked hidden assets for high-net-worth clients going through vicious divorces and hostile corporate dissolutions. I knew every financial institution in the state, from the commercial branches on the corner to the private equity firms hidden in glass skyscrapers. I recognized that crest immediately. It belonged to the most exclusive private wealth management bank in downtown Atlanta. It was a financial fortress that did not advertise its services anywhere. You had to be invited to bank there, and the minimum initial deposit simply to open a basic holding account was $10 million. It was a place designed for corporate titans, corrupt politicians, and people who needed their money to disappear completely from the eyes of the federal government. My father banked there. Chloe's husband held his corporate trust accounts there. I stared at the laser-cut key resting in the palm of my hand. A retired public school teacher, living in a modest house on the south side of Atlanta, had absolutely no business holding a safety deposit key for an elite billionaire-tier financial institution. Unless she knew exactly what was inside that vault. The narrative my family had maintained for 30 years was beginning to fracture right in front of my eyes. Desmond was not a self-made genius who pulled himself up by his bootstraps. Vivian's lavish lifestyle was not funded by honest, hardworking logistics contracts. Chloe and Preston were not inheriting a clean, respectable corporate empire. Grandma Ruby had known everything. She had sat in her rocking chair watching my father build his glittering castle on a foundation of lies, and she had quietly, methodically tracked every single dirty dollar. And when she knew she was dying, she did not hand the map to the golden child. She did not hand it to the corporate lawyer's son-in-law. She bypassed her own son entirely and dropped the weapon directly into the hands of the one person in the family trained to tear financial lies apart. I closed my laptop and gripped the key tightly in my fist, the sharp edges pressing into my palm. They wanted to treat me like a parasitic embarrassment. They wanted to bury my grandmother's legacy in the mud. I grabbed my purse and my car keys. I was going to follow the money, and I was going to burn their fake empire to the ground. The morning sun glinted off the towering glass facades of downtown Atlanta as I pulled my car into the subterranean parking garage of the Sterling Trust Building. This was not a commercial bank where ordinary people deposited their paychecks or applied for modest car loans. There were no brightly colored banners advertising free checking accounts or mortgage rates. Sterling Trust was a fortress of silent wealth. It occupied the top 10 floors of the high-rise, but its private client reception was located on the ground floor, hidden behind unmarked frosted glass doors, flanked by twin bronze columns. I had worn a tailored charcoal gray power suit, shedding the mud-stained morning clothes of yesterday for the armor of my profession. I carried my leather briefcase over my shoulder, but my grip was tightest on Grandma Ruby's weathered savings book and the laser-cut metal key. I pushed through the heavy doors and stepped into a lobby that felt more like a modern art museum than a financial institution. The air was chilled and carried the faint scent of expensive cedar and polished marble. Acoustic panels absorbed the sound of my heels as I walked toward the crescent-shaped reception desk. Behind the desk sat a woman whose nameplate read Tanya. She wore a pristine white silk blouse and possessed the practiced neutral expression of someone trained to handle billionaires who demanded absolute discretion. Tanya looked up as I approached, her eyes conducting a rapid, subtle assessment of my suit, my briefcase, and my demeanor. I knew the look well. It was the gatekeeper assessment, deciding if I was a lost tourist seeking an ATM or someone who actually belonged in this sanctuary of extreme wealth. "Good morning," Tanya said, her voice perfectly modulated to sound helpful yet distant. "How may I assist you today?" I placed my briefcase on the marble counter and reached inside. "I am here to access a private safety deposit box and verify the status of the associated routing nodes," I replied evenly. Tanya offered a small, tight smile. "I understand. However, access to our secure vaults requires a prior appointment and primary account holder verification. Do you have your client identification card?" "I do not have a client card," I said, maintaining absolute eye contact, "but I do have the access key and the primary routing ledger." I placed Grandma Ruby's savings book on the counter, open to the page with the offshore routing numbers, and laid the heavy laser-cut key precisely in the center of the open pages. The contrast between the battered stained leather of the old passbook and the flawless modern metal of the key was striking. Tanya looked down at the items, her polite smile slipping into a slight frown of confusion. She reached out and picked up the key, turning it over to inspect the engraved crest and the 10-digit alphanumeric serial number. I could see the exact moment she recognized the tier of the key. Her posture straightened instantly. The dismissive gatekeeper vanished, replaced by an alert, cautious professional. "This is a black tier secure access key," Tanya stated, her voice dropping a fraction of an octave as she looked back up at me. "These are only issued to our highest-level corporate trust clients. May I ask how you came into possession of this, ma'am?" "It was bequeathed to me." I answered, my tone leaving no room for negotiation. "The ledger beneath it contains the corresponding account sequences. I need you to run the primary routing node to verify the account status before we proceed to the vault." Tanya hesitated, her trained instincts warring with the undeniable proof of the black tier key in her hand. In the world of extreme wealth management, you do not question the bearer of such a key without risking the wrath of a very powerful client. She nodded slowly, pulling the open savings book toward her keyboard. She did not ask for my name again. She simply directed her attention to her dual monitors. I stood perfectly still, watching her manicured fingers fly across the mechanical keyboard. As a forensic accountant, I spent my life observing the digital footprints of money. But right now, I was observing the human reaction to it. Tanya typed in the first sequence of numbers, the offshore routing code my grandmother had meticulously written down. She hit the enter key. The reflection of the monitor danced across Tanya's eyeglasses. I watched as her eyes scanned the data populating on her screen. At first, her expression was merely focused, but then a distinct sequence of red warning banners must have flashed across her terminal. I saw the vibrant color reflect in her lenses. Tanya stopped typing. Her hands froze completely, hovering just above the keyboard. I watched the blood drain rapidly from her face, leaving her skin a pale, sickly gray. Her jaw went slack, and she swallowed hard, a visible gulp of sheer panic. The professional composure she had worn like a shield shattered entirely in a matter of seconds. "Is there a problem with the routing number?" I asked, my voice calm, though my own pulse began to accelerate. Tanya did not look at me. She could not look at me. Her hands began to tremble so violently that I could hear her fingernails clicking erratically against the plastic keys as she fumbled to input a master override command. With a sharp, sudden clack, she locked her computer terminal, turning the screens completely black. She took a ragged breath and abruptly pushed her chair back, reaching frantically beneath the heavy marble desk. I knew exactly what that movement meant. I had audited enough banks to know the exact placement of emergency protocols. Tanya was hitting the silent alarm. "Ma'am," Tanya stammers, her voice dropping to a terrified, breathless whisper that barely carried across the counter. "I need you to stay exactly where you are. Do not move." She turned her head slightly toward a junior clerk who had just stepped out from a back office carrying a stack of files. Tanya grabbed the clerk's sleeve, pulling him close. Her voice was meant to be a secret, but the sheer terror in her tone made it carry through the silent lobby. "Call the police," Tanya commanded, her eyes darting back to me with absolute dread. "Right now. Do not let her leave." The junior clerk dropped his files, the papers scattering across the floor, and immediately reached for his desk phone. The atmosphere in the lobby shifted from serene luxury to suffocating tension in a heartbeat. My forensic brain immediately began to categorize the situation. You do not hit a silent alarm and call the police for a simple, overdrawn account. You do not panic like that over standard tax evasion or corporate embezzlement. The reaction Tanya just had was reserved for something massive, something dangerous. The sequence in Grandma Ruby's book was tied to an account flagged by federal authorities. It had to be a primary node for an operation so severe that the bank's internal system automatically triggered a lockdown protocol to trap anyone attempting to access it. My father had not just stolen from the church, he had entangled his logistics empire with something highly criminal, something that had the federal government waiting and watching for anyone foolish enough to use that key. And I had just walked right into the snare. Before I could even formulate a thought to de-escalate the situation, a loud mechanical thud echoed through the lobby. I turned my head just in time to see the heavy frosted glass doors at the main entrance slide shut. A thick steel deadbolt engaged at the top and bottom of the frame with a harsh metallic clank. The magnetic lockdown was absolute. The bank was sealed. The faint ambient music playing overhead abruptly cut off, leaving a ringing silence in the large cavernous space. Then came the sound of heavy tactical footsteps. From the shadowed corridors flanking the reception area, 3 security guards emerged. These were not the typical board security personnel you find at a local branch. These were heavily built, highly trained private contractors wearing reinforced tactical vests. They moved with terrifying precision, fanning out in a wide semicircle to cut off any possible route of escape I might have considered. They did not shout or draw their weapons immediately, but their intent was unmistakable. All 3 guards came to a halt 10 feet away from me. They stood with their feet braced shoulder-width apart, their right hands resting purposefully on the grips of their holstered firearms. The lead guard, a tall man with a severe, scarred face, locked his eyes on me. "Step away from the counter, miss," he ordered. His voice was a deep, resonant rumble that demanded absolute compliance. Keep your hands where we can see them. I looked back at Tanya, who was shrinking away from the desk, terrified that I might be dangerous. I looked at the heavy glass doors that blocked my exit. I was standing in the middle of a high-security financial fortress, holding the keys to my father's illicit empire, and I was completely trapped. I slowly raised my hands, my mind racing as I calculated my only way out of a federal trap I never saw coming. The heavy glass doors of the bank lobby hissed open behind the armed guards. A team of men wearing dark windbreakers pushed through the entrance, their badges flashing under the harsh recessed lighting. Leading them was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a face carved from granite and eyes that had seen entirely too many corporate criminals. Detective Wallace did not walk so much as he marched. He bypassed the terrified bank teller, snatched Grandma Ruby's savings book and the black tier key from the marble counter, and turned his piercing gaze directly on me. "Secure the suspect," Wallace ordered. Before I could utter a single word of protest, two federal agents flanked me, gripping my arms with bruising force. They did not drag me out to a police cruiser in the street. Instead, they marched me deep into the bowels of the private bank, pushing past the velvet-lined consultation rooms and into a sterile, windowless security office that smelled of harsh floor wax and stale coffee. They shoved me into a cold metal chair and locked the heavy reinforced door behind them. Wallace stood across the metal table, tossing the leather savings book down between us. He leaned forward, placing his large hands flat on the surface, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me. The two agents stood perfectly still by the door, their hands resting on their tactical belts. "You have made a catastrophic mistake walking in here today," Wallace said, his voice a low, threatening rumble that echoed in the small room. "You think you are untouchable because of your father. You think Desmond's money can buy you out of a federal hold. That key you just tried to use is tied to an account currently under a Title 31 Patriot Act freeze. Do you know what that means, Zora? It means you are sitting in a federal trap and you are going to prison for a very long time." I sat back in my chair and crossed my legs, smoothing the fabric of my custom black suit. I did not flinch. I did not cry. I let a long, heavy silence stretch between us until his aggressive posturing began to look utterly ridiculous. "Are you quite finished with the bad cop routine?" I asked, calmly keeping my voice perfectly level. Wallace narrowed his eyes, clearly taken aback by my complete lack of panic. Criminal suspects usually broke down weeping or immediately demanded a lawyer. I did neither. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table, mirroring his posture, but projecting absolute authority. "You are trying to treat me like a spoiled heiress who stumbled into Daddy's bank vault to withdraw shopping money. Let me save us both a tremendous amount of time, Detective. I do not work for Desmond. I dropped out of the family business 10 years ago to build my own forensic accounting firm. I track missing millions for a living. I audit shell companies that make this bank look like a neighborhood lemonade stand. So when you tell me an account is under a Title 31 freeze, I know exactly what that means." I tapped my fingernail against the leather cover of my grandmother's book. "I know it means the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network flagged this specific routing node for severe anti-money laundering violations. I also know that a freeze of that magnitude is never triggered by a simple computer algorithm. It requires direct physical proof of illicit structuring. You did not just stumble onto this account, Wallace. You have been watching it. And the only reason you are trying to intimidate me right now is because you hit a firewall you cannot breach." Wallace stood up straight, the aggressive scowl melting away into a mask of cautious curiosity. He exchanged a quick, uncertain glance with the agent standing by the door, then looked back down at me. "You have the account flagged," I continued, maintaining my relentless eye contact and keeping the pressure on him. "You have the black tier key. But you cannot touch the actual funds, and you cannot secure the federal indictment against my father, because the money is buried behind a complex sequence of offshore holding companies in the Cayman Islands and Cyprus. You need the cipher. You need the shadow ledger to map the exact flow of the cash, otherwise Desmond's corporate lawyers will tie you up in jurisdictional red tape for the next 20 years. The silence in the security office was deafening. The agents by the door shifted uncomfortably. I had completely dismantled his interrogation tactic in less than 3 minutes. I had proven that I was not a clueless pawn in my father's game. I had established that I was the smartest person in the room and that they needed me far more than I needed them. Wallace let out a slow, heavy breath and pulled out the metal chair across from me. He sat down, running a hand over his short-cropped hair. The intimidating federal agent routine vanished entirely, replaced by the exhausted demeanor of a man who had been working a massive case for far too long. "You really are not working for him," Wallace said quietly, almost speaking to himself. "I would rather burn his empire to the ground than work for him," I replied without hesitation. Wallace nodded slowly, finally accepting my truth. He reached inside his dark windbreaker and pulled out a thick, heavily redacted manila folder. He dropped it onto the metal table right next to the savings book. "Your father is not just running a lucrative logistics and real estate company, Zora. Desmond is operating one of the largest money laundering syndicates on the East Coast. He uses his legitimate shipping routes to move illicit funds for offshore clients. He cleans the dirty cash through a maze of fake commercial real estate developments before it finally hits this private bank. We have been trying to build a solid racketeering case against him for 5 long years. He is incredibly careful. He is ruthless. And he covers his digital tracks perfectly. Every time we get close to a shell company, Preston files a mountain of corporate injunctions and burns the paper trail." I stared at the thick folder, the devastating reality of my father's true business settling over me. I had always known Desmond's practices were unethical. I knew he exploited loopholes and bullied local contractors. But federal racketeering and international money laundering were entirely different monsters. It meant my family's entire legacy was nothing but a criminal enterprise dressed up in expensive suits and country club memberships. If he is that careful, I asked my forensic mind, already processing the data. "How did you manage to get a federal freeze on his primary offshore account? How did you even know this specific black tier key existed in the first place?" Wallace looked at me, a profound, heavy sadness entering his eyes. He reached across the table and placed his large hand gently over the worn leather of my grandmother's savings book. "Because we had an informant on the inside," Wallace explained softly. "A silent partner who fed us just enough breadcrumbs to keep the federal investigation alive. Someone who sat quietly in the background for years, watching Desmond build his corrupt empire, taking meticulous notes on every single dirty dollar that flowed through the family business." My breath caught in my throat. The sterile walls of the interrogation room seemed to close in around me. I looked down at the faded passbook resting on the table. The mundane grocery list that inexplicably turned into offshore routing numbers. The laser-cut key taped securely to the inside of the back cover. The way she had insisted the book go to me and no one else. "Grandma Ruby," I whispered, the revelation hitting me with the sheer force of a freight train. She was not senile. Zora Wallace confirmed, his voice filled with deep respect. "She was a federal informant. She approached our field office 3 years ago. She knew her son was destroying the community and permanently tainting the family name. She spent the last years of her life secretly building a shadow ledger to dismantle his entire operation from the inside out. But her health failed before she could give us the final cipher. On her deathbed, she told us she would hide the master key and the ledger where Desmond would never think to look. She told us she would leave it to the only person in the family smart enough to decode it." Wallace pushed the heavy manila folder across the metal table until it touched my hands. "Desmond knows the feds are circling. He knows the primary offshore account is frozen. He is going to panic and he is going to start covering his tracks aggressively. We have less than a week before he completely liquidates everything and moves the money to a non-extradition country. I have the federal warrants ready to sign, but I do not have the undeniable financial proof to hold him. I need your forensic skills, Zora. I need you to decode the rest of Grandma Ruby's shadow ledger before your father destroys everything she fought for." The drive from the federal building back to my midtown brownstone felt entirely different than the drive there. The heavy manila folder Detective Wallace had entrusted to me sat inside my leather briefcase, pressed right up against Grandma Ruby's worn savings book. It felt like a physical weight on the passenger seat, an anchor tethering me to a dangerous new reality I was still trying to fully process. My father was not just a ruthless, arrogant businessman who stepped on the little guy to get ahead. He was a criminal architect. Desmond was operating one of the largest money laundering syndicates on the East Coast, and the only thing standing between him and a clean, untraceable getaway was the decryption I was about to perform. My forensic training was already kicking into overdrive, my mind sorting through the implications of the frozen Sterling Trust account and the federal warrants waiting for my proof. Turning onto my quiet, tree-lined street, the fragile illusion of peace shattered instantly. A massive, gleaming black SUV was parked illegally across my driveway, its dark tinted windows reflecting the harsh afternoon sun. I recognized the vehicle immediately. It was Desmond's primary town car. Standing on the pristine masonry of my front porch were four people who had explicitly told me I was a parasitic embarrassment just 24 hours ago at a graveside. My father paced across my restored porch like a caged predator, his heavy footsteps echoing against the brick. My mother Vivian stood near my custom oak front door, with her arms tightly crossed, her designer handbag clutched to her chest like a protective shield. Chloe leaned against my wrought iron railing, scrolling on her phone with an air of profound boredom, while Preston stood beside her, his tailored suit perfectly pressed, looking incredibly smug. I parked my car on the street, killed the engine, and took a slow, deep breath to steady my racing pulse. Wallace had warned me that Desmond's internal informants at the private bank would alert him the moment the freeze code was triggered. I just did not expect my father to deploy the entire family unit to my doorstep this quickly. They were terrified. They were trying desperately to mask their panic with their usual brand of arrogant superiority, but my profession taught me to read people just as well as I read balance sheets. Desmond's frantic pacing, Vivian's white-knuckled grip on her bag, Preston's rigid, overly confident posture. They were bleeding fear. I stepped out of my car, locking it with a sharp chirp that made all four of them snap their heads in my direction. I walked up my front pathway, my heels clicking rhythmically against the stone pavers. I did not hurry. I let them wait in the suffocating Georgia heat, holding my leather briefcase tightly against my side. "What are you doing at my house?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly flat and devoid of any emotion as I reached the bottom of the steps. Desmond stopped pacing and moved to block the stairs, his large frame attempting to physically intimidate me. "You have exactly 10 seconds to hand over that book, Zora," he commanded, his voice a dangerous, low rumble, meant to instill absolute compliance. "I know you went to Sterling Trust this morning. I know you triggered a security protocol on a highly classified corporate account. You have absolutely no idea what you are dealing with, and you are playing stupid games with classified company property." "Company property?" I echoed, raising an eyebrow and holding my ground. "That is a fascinating legal claim, Dad. Since when does a retired public school teacher use her personal savings book to store classified corporate property for your logistics firm?" Desmond's jaw tightened, a thick vein pulsing visibly at his temple. "Do not play smart with me. That ledger contains proprietary access codes that belong to my business. Your grandmother was confused in her final days. She took things that did not belong to her because her mind was failing. Give the book to me right now, or I will have you arrested for corporate espionage and theft." "Arrested?" I challenged, taking a step up the stairs, so I was looking directly into his furious eyes. "Please, Dad, call the police right now. Let us have the Atlanta Police Department come out here to my property. Better yet, let us call the federal authorities. We can hand the ledger over to them and let the government decide who exactly owns the proprietary access codes hidden inside." My father flinched. It was a microscopic movement, a slight pulling back of his broad shoulders, but I caught it immediately. He could not involve the authorities, and he knew that I knew it. He was trapped in his own bluff. Before Desmond could recover his footing, Vivian pushed past him, her face a carefully constructed mask of manufactured maternal disappointment. She placed a hand on her chest, her diamond rings catching the sunlight. "Zora, stop this nonsense immediately. Why are you doing this to us? Why are you deliberately trying to tear this family apart out of pure spite?" I looked at my mother, marveling at her endless capacity to spin any narrative to suit her emotional needs. I am not tearing anything apart, Vivian. I am trying to walk through my own front door. You are acting like a petulant, vindictive child. Vivian continued, her voice rising in a dramatic cadence designed for an audience. You have always been so jealous of Chloe. You could never stand that your sister stepped up to take the mantle of the family legacy while you ran off to play independent woman in this rented dump. We just buried your grandmother yesterday, and instead of mourning with your family with dignity, you are trying to hold your father's business hostage just to get attention. It is pathetic. Be a strong black woman, Zora. Stop embarrassing us, put your petty grievances aside, and bear this burden for the sake of the family's image. Hand your father the book. I glanced at Chloe, who finally bothered to look up from her smartphone screen. She let out a loud, theatrical sigh, adjusting her designer sunglasses. Honestly, Zora, you are exhausting to be around. You live in a neighborhood you can barely afford, wearing suits you probably bought on credit, trying to act like you are somehow in our league. Just give Dad this stupid ledger so we can go back to our actual lives. We have a charity gala to prepare for tonight, and I do not want to smell like Midtown humidity all evening. You do not need to worry about my finances, Chloe, I said smoothly, my grip tightening on the handle of my briefcase. And you certainly do not need to worry about my neighborhood. Preston had apparently heard enough of the family bickering. He stepped down from the porch, physically inserting his tall frame between me and my father. He unbuttoned his suit jacket with a practiced, intimidating flourish and reached into his breast pocket. He looked down at me, a cruel, mocking smile playing on his thin lips. He exuded the kind of smug, condescending authority he reserved for hostile corporate depositions. "Let me handle this, Desmond," Preston said, not even looking back at his father-in-law. Preston pulled out a thick, legally bound document folded in thirds and thrust it aggressively toward my chest. I did not raise my hands to take it. I simply watched it fall to the ground, landing with a soft thud against the stone steps between my feet. Preston scoffed, shaking his head as if dealing with a slow child. "That is a formal cease and desist order drafted by my firm. It officially bars you from accessing, disseminating, or utilizing any proprietary financial data belonging to Desmond's corporate entities. We know you tried to breach the Sterling Trust account this morning. The bank flagged your unauthorized attempt and froze the assets to protect my client." I stared at him, keeping my expression entirely unreadable. My forensic mind rapidly processed his words. He actually believed the bank froze the account because of my physical presence. Desmond and Preston did not know about the federal investigation yet. They thought this was a simple banking error caused by an unauthorized user triggering a standard security flag. They thought they were still in complete control of the situation. Preston took a step closer, invading my personal space, trying to use his height and his gender to force me to back down. "Listen to me carefully, Zora. You do not understand how high-level finance works. You are a small-time bookkeeper playing in a billionaire's sandbox. Hand over the book right now, or I will litigate you into absolute oblivion. I will freeze your meager little bank accounts. I will garnish your wages, and I will have you evicted from this charming little rental you love so much. I will litigate you into homelessness." I looked down at the folded legal document resting on the stone step. Then I slowly raised my gaze back up to Preston's smug, impeccably groomed face. He actually believed his threats carried weight. He adjusted his silk tie, leaning closer as if preparing to deliver a lecture to a slow, uneducated student. "You see, Zora," Preston said, lowering his voice into a patronizing drawl, "corporate litigation is a game of unlimited resources. Your father has unlimited resources. You have a boutique accounting firm that barely pulls in 6 figures on a good year. If you do not hand over that ledger right now, I will file an ex parte injunction before the courts even open tomorrow morning. I will freeze your business accounts. I will drag you through discovery until your legal fees bankrupt you completely. And when your landlord realizes you are tangled in a massive corporate lawsuit, you will be evicted from this charming little historical project. Listen to me carefully, Zora. You do not understand how high-level finance works. Hand over the book, or I will litigate you into homelessness." I let him finish. I let the silence hang in the thick, suffocating Atlanta heat. Chloe was smirking behind him, her arms crossed in victory. My mother looked entirely vindicated, her chin raised in approval of her son-in-law. Desmond stood at the bottom of the steps with his broad chest puffed out, waiting for my inevitable crushing surrender. "Are you quite done explaining first-year law school concepts to me, Preston?" I asked, keeping my tone deadly calm and perfectly even. Preston frowned, his smug smile faltering just a fraction as he processed my complete lack of fear. First of all, I continued taking one deliberate step down the stairs so I was directly at eye level with him. "I do not have a landlord. I purchased this brownstone in cash 2 years ago. The deed is held in a blind trust under my firm's name. You cannot evict me from my own property. Secondly, your little cease and desist order is completely worthless because you are not dealing with a civil corporate dispute." I stepped closer, invading his personal space just as he had done to me seconds prior. "Let me educate you on how high-level federal law actually works, Preston. The account you are trying to protect is currently under a Title 31 Patriot Act freeze. Do you know what happens when you threaten someone holding evidence tied to an active federal money laundering investigation? It falls under Title 18 of the United States Code Section 1512. Preston swallowed hard. The arrogant color began to drain rapidly from his face. "That is the federal statute for tampering with a witness victim or an informant," I said, making sure my voice carried clearly past him to my father. "Threatening to bankrupt me and render me homeless to secure a shadow ledger tied to a federal racketeering case is a felony. You just threatened a federal witness in front of 3 other people. You are looking at up to 20 years in federal prison for that threat alone." Desmond uncrossed his arms. The aggressive predatory posture vanished instantly, replaced by sheer unadulterated shock. "Federal witness," my father repeated, his voice dropping to a harsh, ragged whisper. "You thought you were so smart, Dad," I said, shifting my relentless gaze to him. "You thought Grandma Ruby was just a confused, senile old woman. But she sat in the corner of your lavish parties for years, watching you move dirty money through your logistics routes. She took meticulous notes. She built the cipher. And she handed it directly to me because she knew I was the only person in this family with the forensic skills to tear your fake empire to the ground." Vivian gasped, taking a stumbling step backward, as if she had been physically struck. "You are lying, Zora. Desmond is a legitimate businessman. He built this family." "Stop protecting him, Vivian," I snapped. "You know exactly where the money comes from. You just look the other way so you can keep your country club memberships." I turned my attention back to Preston, who was now staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. I was not finished dismantling him. He had spent years treating me like an uneducated peasant, and it was time to collect the debt. "And you, Preston," I said, lowering my voice so only the 4 of them could hear the venom in my words. "You think you are immune because you hide behind your elite corporate consulting firm. What is the name of it again?" "Apex Solutions." Preston opened his mouth to speak, but absolutely no sound came out. His lips trembled slightly. I ran the routing nodes this morning. I continued relentlessly watching him break apart piece by piece. I tracked the flow of capital from Desmond's offshore Cayman accounts right back onto American soil. I know that Apex Solutions is nothing but a shell company. You do not consult for anyone, Preston. You funnel Desmond's dirty money through fake commercial real estate acquisitions to wash it clean. You are not a high-powered corporate attorney. You are a glorified laundry machine. Preston went completely pale. His skin turned a sickly shade of gray, and he took a stumbling step backward, nearly tripping over his own expensive leather shoes. He looked back at Desmond's sheer, absolute panic radiating from his entire body. Chloe grabbed Preston's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his suit jacket. "Preston, what is she talking about? Tell her she is crazy. Tell her she is lying." Preston could not even look at his wife. He was staring at me as if I held a loaded weapon pointed directly at his chest. "In the financial world, I did. You have no proof," Desmond growled, stepping forward again, his fists clenched tight at his sides. "You have a book full of old grocery lists. The feds have nothing on me." "They have the black tier key," I replied, my voice slicing through the heavy, humid air like a scalpel. "And they have me." I did not wait for their response. I turned my back on them, walked up the remaining stone steps, and stepped inside my house. I grabbed the heavy oak door and slammed it shut with a resounding, thunderous crack that shook the front windows. I immediately engaged the deadbolt and the secondary security chain, leaving my family standing on the porch in a state of total devastation. I leaned back against the solid wood of the door, taking a deep, shuddering breath. The silence inside my brownstone was thick and heavy. I had just declared war on my own blood. I had drawn a line in the sand that could never be uncrossed. But there was absolutely no time to process the emotional fallout. My phone vibrated violently inside my suit jacket pocket. I pulled it out. The screen displayed an automated alert from my primary commercial bank. I swiped the notification open. The message was cold, clinical, and terrifying. Access to your personal and business checking accounts has been temporarily suspended due to suspicious activity. Please contact your branch manager immediately. My heart hammered against my ribs. I tapped the banking app icon, holding my breath as the loading screen vanished. My balance showed zero available funds. A bright red banner across the top of the screen indicated a hard freeze on all outgoing and incoming transfers. Desmond had not waited. The moment he realized I triggered the Sterling Trust account this morning, he had executed a financial hit. He still wielded massive corrupt influence in the Atlanta banking sector, and he had pulled every favor he had to lock me out of my own money. He was trying to suffocate me before I could decode the rest of Grandma Ruby's ledger. He wanted me panicked, broke, and desperate. Before I could even dial my bank representative to fight the freeze, my phone rang. The caller ID showed the name of my largest independent client, a mid-sized healthcare network that accounted for nearly 40% of my firm's annual revenue. I answered the call immediately. "This is Zora." "Zora, it is Marcus," the chief financial officer said. His voice was tight, incredibly uncomfortable, and rushed. "Listen, I am calling to inform you that the board has decided to go in a different direction. We are terminating your auditing contract effective immediately." "Marcus, what is going on?" I demanded, my grip tightening on the phone. "We are in the middle of a massive quarterly review. You cannot just pull the plug without cause." "I am sorry," Zora Marcus said quickly. "We received a call from a major logistics partner. They threatened to pull their supply chain contracts with our entire hospital network if we continued doing business with your firm. They said you were under federal investigation for corporate espionage. I have to protect the hospital. I am sorry." The line went dead. I lowered the phone from my ear, a cold wave of realization washing over me. Desmond was systematically destroying my livelihood. He was burning my clients, freezing my assets, and trying to isolate me completely. My phone rang again instantly. It was Harrison Miller, my second largest client, a commercial real estate developer whose accounts kept my lights on and my servers running. Zora Harrison barked the moment I answered. "What the hell is going on? I just got a call from Desmond's people. They are telling me that if I do not drop you as my forensic auditor, they will tie up my zoning permits for the new downtown high-rise. I cannot afford those kinds of delays. I am pulling your contract." "Harrison, do not let him bully you," I urged, pacing toward my kitchen. "He is bluffing." "It is not a bluff to me," Harrison shot back. "I am sorry, Zora. Consider our business relationship terminated." He hung up. I tossed the phone onto my kitchen island, the device sliding across the pristine white marble. Desmond had executed a flawless, coordinated strike. In less than 10 minutes, my family had tried to intimidate me. My bank accounts had been zeroed out, and my two biggest clients had severed all ties. I was officially bleeding out financially. I looked down at my leather briefcase. Desmond thought he could break me by taking away my money and my reputation. He fundamentally misunderstood who I was. I did not need his permission to survive, and I certainly did not need his money to fight back. I unclasped the briefcase and pulled out Grandma Ruby's weathered savings book, laying it flat under the bright kitchen pendant lights. It was time to decode the rest of the shadow ledger and burn his empire down. I stared at my phone resting on the marble island. The screen was completely dark, but the implications of those two canceled contracts were glaringly bright. Desmond was not just trying to teach me a lesson, he was trying to erase me from the Atlanta business community entirely. I walked over to the refrigerator and pulled out a bottle of sparkling water, twisting the cap off with a sharp crack. I needed to assess the full blast radius of his strike before I made my next move. I booted up my secondary laptop, bypassing my commercial network entirely and routing through an encrypted virtual private network. I logged into my firm's primary operating accounts, the payroll reserves, and my personal emergency funds spread across 3 different credit unions. Access denied. Account suspended. Contact branch administrator. The red warning banners multiplied across my dual monitors, painting the dark kitchen in a harsh crimson glow. Desmond had called in every favor, every golf course handshake, and every backroom political deal he had accumulated over 30 years. To execute a hard freeze across multiple independent financial institutions within 10 minutes required a level of leverage that bordered on terrifying. He was methodically cutting off my oxygen. Without operational capital, I could not pay my forensic team. I could not retain defensive legal counsel, and I could not pay the property taxes on this brownstone. He wanted to trap me in a cage of my own sudden poverty. My phone vibrated violently against the marble, breaking the heavy silence of the house. This time, it was not a panicked client. It was an automated push alert from a social media monitoring software I utilized for corporate background checks. My own name was trending locally across multiple platforms. I clicked the secure link. It redirected me instantly to Chloe's primary profile. She had uploaded a video 15 minutes ago. It already had thousands of views, hundreds of shares, and a rapidly multiplying comment section. I hit play, leaning back against the counter to watch my sister perform the role of a lifetime. Chloe sat on the edge of her pristine white leather sofa. She wore a muted beige cashmere sweater that made her look soft, approachable, and vulnerable. Her makeup was expertly minimal, her eyes artificially red-rimmed as if she had been crying for hours. She looked directly into the camera lens with an expression of profound, exhausted sorrow. "I never wanted to make a private family matter public." Chloe began, her voice trembling with perfectly calibrated grief. "But my family is living through an absolute nightmare right now. We just laid my beloved grandmother to rest yesterday. We are grieving. We are shattered. But instead of mourning with us in peace, my estranged sister Zora has decided to use this tragedy to extort our grieving father." Chloe paused, pressing a tissue to her eye to catch a single highly produced tear. "Zora has struggled with severe mental instability for years." Chloe continued, her tone dripping with toxic manufactured pity. "She has always deeply resented my father's hard-earned success and my happy marriage to Preston. Today, she crossed a line we can no longer ignore. She showed up at my father's private bank, making wild, delusional demands, screaming at the tellers, and threatening to destroy our family business with fabricated lies if we did not pay her millions of dollars. We have tried for years to get her psychiatric help. We have tried to welcome her back into the fold with open arms, but she is completely unstable and motivated entirely by jealousy and greed. Please keep our family in your prayers as we deal with this extortion." The video ended. I watched it a second time, my expression hardening into absolute stone. It was a masterpiece of digital character assassination. Chloe had taken the truth, inverted it completely, and weaponized my independence, framing it as mental instability. She painted herself, Preston, and Desmond as the patient, victimized targets of a greedy, estranged outcast. It was the perfect shield. If I went public with allegations of money laundering, now everyone would write it off as the delusional ravings of a bitter sister trying to ruin her family. I scrolled through the comment section. It was a cesspool of misplaced sympathy for Chloe and vitriol aimed directly at me. People I went to high school with, local politicians Desmond sponsored, and the wives of Preston's corporate partners were all chiming in to offer their prayers and condemn my supposed extortion. But the real tangible damage was not in the comment section. It was in my professional inbox. I opened my secure email terminal. Messages were flooding in from Atlanta's tight-knit business community. Vendors, prospective corporate clients, and industry peers were rapidly and quietly stepping back from my firm. "Zora, in light of recent public developments regarding your family, we are pausing our contract negotiations indefinitely. Zora, the board feels it is best to suspend our auditing partnership until your personal legal matters are fully resolved. Desmond was starving me out, and Chloe was burning my professional reputation to ash. They wanted me cornered financially and socially. They expected me to break under the immense pressure. They expected me to pick up the phone call Desmond, in a panic beg for my accounts to be unfrozen, and offer Grandma Ruby's ledger in exchange for my life back. They wanted me to submit like an obedient, defeated failure. I closed the email terminal and pushed the laptop away. I did not cry. I did not panic. I felt a cold, absolute clarity wash over me, sharpening my focus to a razor's edge. My family had made a fatal miscalculation. They assumed that because they valued social status, country club gossip, and corporate reputation above all else, I shared those exact same vulnerabilities. They thought taking away my liquid cash and my standing in the Atlanta business elite would paralyze me. They completely forgot that I built my entire life in the trenches of forensic data. I lived in the shadows of balance sheets, tracking the very crimes they were trying so desperately to hide. Desmond was acting out of sheer terror. He deployed this massive scorched earth tactic because he knew exactly what was inside Grandma Ruby's ledger. He knew that if I decoded the offshore routing nodes, his logistics empire would collapse under a federal racketeering indictment. He was trying to distract me with a catastrophic personal crisis, so I would not have the time or the mental bandwidth to look at the numbers. I walked to the kitchen counter and picked up the heavy laser-cut black tier key. The metal was cold and solid against my palm. I walked over to the espresso machine, loaded a fresh pod, and brewed a massive mug of black coffee. The bitter, dark scent filled the kitchen, grounding me completely in the present moment. I was not a victim. I was a forensic weapon, and the safety was officially off. I carried the coffee mug and the key to my dining room table, sweeping aside a stack of mundane mail to clear a massive workspace. I retrieved my primary workstation, a heavy-duty, custom-built processing tower designed specifically for handling massive data decryption and secured federal audits. I connected 3 high-definition monitors and wired the system directly into my hardline backup internet router, completely bypassing the compromised commercial connection. I sat down in my leather chair, taking a slow, scalding sip of the coffee. I opened Grandma Ruby's weathered leather savings book and placed it directly beneath my high-intensity desk lamp. Detective Wallace had told me I had less than a week before Desmond realized the federal authorities were closing in, liquidated all his assets, and moved the dirty money to a non-extradition country. Judging by the ferocity and speed of Desmond's attack today, I estimated my timeline was much shorter. I had less than 48 hours before he vanished completely. I flipped past the first 40 pages of the ledger, ignoring the fake grocery lists, the peach cobbler recipes, and the mundane church tithes. I turned directly to the rigid block lettering in the back half of the book. The offshore routing nodes for the Cayman Islands, Cyprus, and Switzerland were just the surface layer. They were the doors. I needed to find the hidden hallways connecting those offshore accounts directly to Preston's domestic shell company, Apex Solutions. I booted up my proprietary decryption software, a highly classified program I had coded myself to track hidden asset flows in high-net-worth divorce cases and corporate embezzlements. The center screen glowed bright blue with lines of waiting code. Grandma Ruby had not just written down a list of random bank numbers. She had created a brilliant multi-layered cipher. I pulled a magnifying glass from my desk drawer and leaned in, looking closely at the margins of the brittle paper. Buried within the alphanumeric sequences were faint repeating patterns. There were dates recorded that did not align with any standard calendar. There were massive dollar amounts that fluctuated by exact prime numbers. She had cleverly disguised the corporate identification numbers of Desmond's illicit shell companies as standard transactional timestamps. My fingers hovered over the mechanical keyboard for a split second before they began to fly across the keys. I was no longer the estranged daughter fighting for her family's validation. I was the architect of their total destruction. I inputted the first block of offshore routing numbers from the Cayman account, isolating the prime number fluctuations and cross-referencing them against the public incorporation dates of Apex Solutions. The software hummed heavily, the cooling fans kicking into overdrive as the processor chewed through the complex data. I took another sip of coffee, my eyes locked relentlessly on the scrolling green numbers illuminating my dark dining room. Desmond wanted to starve me out. Chloe wanted to publicly humiliate me. Preston wanted to litigate me into absolute homelessness. They had thrown every weapon they had in their arsenal at me, but they left me with the one thing that actually mattered. They left me the truth. And I was going to crack Grandma Ruby's hardest cipher map, every single dirty dollar they had ever stolen, and hand the entire criminal enterprise directly to Detective Wallace on a silver platter. I typed the final extraction sequence into the terminal, hit execute, and watched the firewall begin to burn. The extraction sequence tore through the first layer of Desmond's digital security with absolute precision. Lines of encrypted alphanumeric garbage cascaded down my center monitor, shifting rapidly as my proprietary algorithm forced the characters into readable banking formats. I took another sip of the scalding black coffee, letting the caffeine fuel my absolute focus. The software isolated the Cayman Island routing nodes, stripping away the proxy addresses Preston had so carefully constructed over the last decade. I watched as millions of dollars in untraceable logistics revenue flowed backward across the screen, snapping to a clean, unbroken line that pointed straight at Apex Solutions. Preston thought he was a mastermind, but his digital footprint was embarrassingly arrogant. He used the same basic routing protocols for every major transfer, relying on the sheer volume of transactions to hide the illicit funds. It was a classic needle in a haystack strategy, effective against a standard auditor, but completely useless against someone holding the exact map of the haystack. Hours bled into the silent Atlanta night. The heavy, suffocating heat outside pressed against the windows of my brownstone, but inside the air conditioning hummed a steady, icy rhythm. I did not stop to eat. I ignored the dull ache forming at the base of my neck. Every time my software hit a dead end, every time Preston had managed to successfully obscure a shell company behind a blind trust, I reached for Grandma Ruby's ledger. The old woman had been an absolute genius. She did not have a degree in computer science, and she did not understand modern blockchain encryption, but she understood patterns. Whenever Desmond moved a massive sum of dirty money through his logistics routes, Grandma Ruby had recorded it using a variation of the Julian calendar, mixed with local Atlanta area codes. She mapped the physical locations of his shipping warehouses to the last 4 digits of the routing numbers. Once I understood her cipher and mapped it onto the decrypted banking data, the entire shadow empire lit up across my dual monitors like a sprawling, toxic web. I traced the transactions chronologically, moving backward through 30 years of corporate deceit. Desmond loved to stand at charity galas and country club dinners, wearing his bespoke tailored suits, puffing out his broad chest while bragging about his humble beginnings. He sold the entire city the narrative of a self-made titan who started with a single beat-up delivery truck and an unmatched, relentless work ethic. He claimed he pulled himself up by his bootstraps through sheer grit, determination, and raw business acumen. He used that fake story to berate me my entire life, constantly reminding me that I lacked his drive and his vision. The numbers scrolling rapidly down my screen told a violently different story. There was no grit. There was no grueling, honest climb to the top. There was no generous business loan from a wealthy mentor willing to take a chance on a young, ambitious man. There was only systematic, calculated theft. As I dug deeper into the oldest offshore accounts, bypassing the incredibly obsolete security protocols of the late 90s, I isolated the exact foundational deposits that birthed his logistics empire. I needed to see the genesis of the corruption. I needed to know exactly how Desmond had funded his very first fleet of commercial trucks. I leaned closer to the monitor, the harsh blue light reflecting off my glasses and illuminating the quiet darkness of my dining room. I ran the deep trace 3 separate times, shifting the parameters, just to ensure my software was not misinterpreting the archaic data structures. But mathematics do not possess the capacity to lie. The numbers were absolute. I cross-referenced the dates of the initial massive capital injection with public municipal records. The first deposit into Desmond's primary offshore holding account occurred exactly 21 days after my grandfather died. My blood ran completely cold. I set my coffee mug down on the table with a heavy thud, my hands suddenly shaking with a fury I had never experienced before. I pulled Grandma Ruby's savings book toward me, flipping past the recent entries and going straight to the very first page. The faded blue ink spelled out a specific routing sequence tied to a major well-known life insurance conglomerate. Desmond did not take out a small business loan. He stole the entirety of his own mother's life insurance payout. My grandfather had worked 35 years at a steel mill, breaking his back and destroying his lungs to ensure his wife would be taken care of when he passed. He paid into that premium every single month. When he died suddenly of a massive heart attack, the payout was supposed to guarantee Grandma Ruby a comfortable, stress-free retirement. Instead, her own son intercepted the funds. He took the money meant to secure her future and funneled it directly into an untraceable corporate account in Cyprus to buy his first fleet of cargo trucks. He left her with absolutely nothing. He forced his own mother to move into a tiny, rundown apartment. He made her rely on his manufactured, controlling charity for the rest of her life. He doled out a meager allowance to her, acting like a generous, benevolent son, while secretly sitting on the millions of dollars he generated using her stolen security net. It was a level of sociopathic greed that completely defied comprehension. But the sickening truth did not end with the life insurance theft. The initial payout was substantial, but it was not enough to cover the massive capital required to launch his international shipping routes. He needed more seed money to establish the necessary bribes and customs payoffs. I highlighted a secondary cluster of deposits made exactly 6 months after the life insurance theft. These transactions were different. They were not one single massive wire transfer. They were smaller, highly systematic, and siphoned over a continuous period of 2 years from a local domestic account in Georgia. I ran the specific routing number through a standard publicly available banking directory, waiting for the search bar to populate the name of the institution. The result popped up in bold white letters on my screen, making my stomach churn with intense physical disgust. The account belonged to Shiloh Community Church. It was the exact parish where Desmond had proudly served as the head financial treasurer during my entire childhood. I stared at the screen, a flood of repressed memories rushing back with sickening clarity. I remembered the massive community-wide fundraising drives the church held to build a new youth center and a community outreach clinic. I remembered bake sales, charity car washes, and special offering envelopes passed down the pews every Sunday morning. I remembered breaking open my own ceramic piggy bank and handing over my small allowance because Desmond had stood at the wooden pulpit looking down at the congregation with a solemn, pious expression, urging everyone to dig deep and give to the Lord's work. The youth center was never built. The community clinic remained an empty dirt lot. At the time, Desmond had stood before the church board and tragically announced that unforeseen construction costs and zoning fees had drained the account. The congregation had wept, prayed for guidance, and simply accepted the loss. He had embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars straight out of the congregation's offering plates. He had looked his neighbors, his friends, and his pastor directly in the eyes while systematically draining their savings into his offshore logistics accounts. He robbed his own grieving mother, and he robbed his own trusting community to build his fake, blood-soaked empire. I pushed my chair back from the desk, standing up in the silent room. The sheer magnitude of his evil was suffocating. My family was currently out in the world playing the victims. Chloe was crying on social media. Preston was drafting fraudulent lawsuits, and Vivian was clutching her pearls in mock horror. They were trying to destroy my reputation and starve me into submission to protect a legacy built entirely on the backs of stolen widows and robbed congregations. I walked back to the kitchen, grabbed the bottle of sparkling water, and drained the rest of it. The cold reality of the situation solidified my resolve into an unbreakable weapon. Desmond thought freezing my bank accounts would render me powerless. He thought isolation would break my spirit. He did not realize that by taking away my career and my money, he had completely removed my restraints. I had absolutely nothing left to lose, which made me the most dangerous person in his world. I walked back to my computer, sitting down with renewed violent focus. I cracked my knuckles, placed my fingers on the keyboard, and began compiling the digital evidence into a massive, undeniable federal dossier. I was going to hand Detective Wallace everything he needed to bury Desmond beneath a federal penitentiary. The morning sun broke through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my downtown office, casting long, harsh shadows across my mahogany desk. The silence in the suite was deafening. My phone lines had not rung once since yesterday afternoon. My receptionist was out sick, and my remaining junior accountants were working remotely, entirely unaware that our firm was bleeding out from a coordinated financial strike. Desmond had successfully severed my professional arteries, leaving my boutique firm completely isolated. He wanted me sitting in this empty office staring at the walls, drowning in panic and regret. But the quiet only gave me the absolute undisturbed focus I needed. I had not slept a single minute. I sat surrounded by neatly stacked color-coded files, each one containing the freshly printed decrypted proof of my father's 30-year criminal enterprise. The federal dossier for Detective Wallace was nearly complete. I had mapped the Cayman Island routing nodes, traced the proxy addresses, and printed the ledger entries, proving Desmond had stolen Grandma Ruby's life insurance payout. I had the hard data showing exactly how Preston used Apex Solutions to wash the cash. But the centerpiece of the dossier sitting directly in front of me was the thick manila folder containing the Shiloh Community Church embezzlement records. The heavy glass door of my office suite swung open, the sharp click of expensive heels echoing against the hardwood floor. I did not look up from my paperwork. I knew exactly who it was. The overwhelming scent of Chanel perfume preceded her by a full 10 seconds. Vivian walked into my private office without knocking. She was dressed immaculately in a tailored white pantsuit, a string of heavy pearls resting against her collarbone. Her hair was styled in perfect soft waves, and her makeup was flawless. She looked like a woman stepping off the cover of a luxury lifestyle magazine, not a woman whose husband was currently under a massive federal racketeering investigation. I leaned back in my leather chair, crossing my arms, and waited. "Zora, look at you," Vivian said, her voice dripping with a manufactured, syrupy maternal warmth. She sighed deeply, shaking her head as she surveyed the stacks of paper on my desk. "You are working yourself into the ground in this empty office. Your father told me about the little misunderstanding with your banking accounts and your clients. I came the moment I heard. I am just so worried about your well-being." I stared at her, marveling at her endless capacity for delusion. "A little misunderstanding," I repeated, keeping my voice completely devoid of emotion. "Desmond orchestrated a targeted financial hit to freeze my assets and terrorize my clients into dropping my firm. That is not a misunderstanding, Vivian. That is corporate sabotage." Vivian pulled up a guest chair and sat down gracefully, crossing her legs. She placed her designer handbag on her lap, folding her hands over it. "You always exaggerate everything, Zora. Your father is simply trying to protect you from yourself. You are confused and acting out because of your grandmother's passing. We all grieve in different ways. But you are letting your emotions cloud your judgment, and you are playing dangerous games with things you do not understand. You are hurting the family, and you are hurting yourself." "I am not the one hurting the family," I replied evenly. "I am just the one turning on the lights." Vivian's warm facade dropped instantly. The maternal concern vanished, replaced by the cold, calculating enforcer I had known my entire life. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing into sharp, dark slits. "Stop this foolishness right now, Zora," Vivian commanded, her voice dropping into a harsh, authoritative register. "I am not going to sit here and negotiate with you like you are some corporate rival. You are my daughter. You owe this family everything you have. Your father put a roof over your head. He paid for your elite education. He gave you the social standing that allows you to operate this little boutique firm in the first place. You are acting ungrateful, selfish, and incredibly naive." I remained perfectly still. I did not take the bait. I simply let her talk, waiting for her to exhaust her prepared script. "We are a prominent, respected family in this city," Vivian continued, her voice rising with arrogant indignation. "People look up to us. They depend on us. You are trying to tear down decades of hard work because you have always been jealous of your father's success. You need to grow up, Zora. Be a strong Black woman." Stop whining about perceived slights, put your petty grievances aside, and bear this burden for the sake of the family's image. Give me the ledger, apologize to your father, and we can make all your banking issues disappear by noon. I looked at my mother. I looked at the pearls around her neck and the diamonds on her fingers. I thought about the sweat on my grandfather's brow as he worked in the steel mill. I thought about the bake sales at Shiloh Community Church, where elderly women sold sweet potato pies to raise money for a youth center that was never built. I picked up the thick manila folder from the center of my desk and slammed it down directly in front of her. The heavy thud echoed loudly in the quiet office. "Open it," I said. Vivian flinched slightly at the noise but refused to touch the folder. "What is this?" she demanded. "That is your legacy, Vivian," I replied, my voice slicing through the air. "That is the burden you want me to bear." I spent all night cracking the shadow ledger. I know exactly how Desmond funded his self-made empire. He did not pull himself up by his bootstraps. He stole Grandpa's life insurance payout and left his own mother to rot in poverty. And when that was not enough capital to launch his offshore logistics routes, he looked for an easier target. I reached across the desk, flipped the folder open, and tapped my index finger against the top document. It was a decrypted routing log showing continuous systematic transfers spanning 24 months. He embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars directly from the Shiloh Community Church Building Fund, I said, staring directly into her eyes. He stood at the pulpit every Sunday, passing the offering plate, praying with those people, and then he went into the back office and wired their savings to a shell company in Cyprus. He robbed his own community. He stole from his own neighbors. That is where your pearls came from, Vivian. I waited for the gasp. I waited for the horror to wash over her face. I waited for the microscopic chance that my mother had been entirely unaware of the depths of Desmond's depravity. Vivian looked down at the banking logs. Her expression did not change. She did not recoil. She did not cover her mouth in shock. Instead, she let out a short, dismissive scoff and casually adjusted her jacket. "You think you are so brilliant, Zora." Vivian said, her tone dripping with absolute unapologetic arrogance. "You look at those numbers and you see theft. You lack vision. You have always lacked vision. Those people at Shiloh were small-minded. They were going to let that money sit in a low-yield savings account, gathering dust for a youth center that nobody actually needed. Your father took that stagnant capital, and he built a global empire." I stared at her, genuinely nauseated by her response. "He stole their money, Vivian. It was a crime. He multiplied that money," Vivian shot back, leaning forward aggressively. "He took pennies and turned them into millions. He created jobs. He built a logistics network that spans the entire eastern seaboard. He elevated this family to a level of wealth and influence those church people could never even comprehend. That money was not stolen, Zora. It was our blessing. It was our divine right. Desmond was chosen to lead, and he took what he needed to build our dynasty." "You are completely delusional," I whispered, utterly repulsed by the woman sitting across from me. "You are justifying the systemic robbery of your own community because it bought you a country club membership. We earned our place in this city." Vivian snapped, her composure finally fracturing into raw, furious entitlement. "And I will not let a bitter, ungrateful child ruin everything we have built over ancient history. You think these old banking logs give you power? You think you can wave these papers around and destroy us? You are too late, Zora. You are playing a small game while your father is operating on a completely different level." Vivian stood up, snatching her designer handbag from the chair. She glared down at me, her eyes blazing with triumphant malice. "You are trying to ruin us over petty church funds when we are on the absolute verge of securing everything." Vivian boasted, her voice echoing loudly in the office. "You think freezing your little accounts was Desmond's primary focus? He swatted you away like a fly so he could finish the real work. By Friday, none of this will matter. The Apex Solutions shell structure will be completely untouchable." She leaned over the desk, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. "Desmond is signing a $50 million merger with Meridian Global this Friday," Vivian declared, a wicked, victorious smile spreading across her lips. "A massive national conglomerate is buying out his entire domestic logistics network. $50 million in clean, untraceable corporate capital. He is cashing out the entire operation. Once those documents are signed on Friday morning, the assets will be liquidated, the offshore accounts will be dissolved, and we are stepping onto the national stage. You cannot touch us. The federal government cannot touch us. We are going to be billionaires, and you are going to be sitting in this empty office with nothing but your self-righteous morality. Vivian turned on her heel and marched toward the glass door. Bear the burden, Zora, she called out over her shoulder, or get crushed underneath it. The heavy glass door swung shut behind her. I sat alone in the quiet office, the morning sunlight warming the stack of decrypted routing logs on my desk. I did not move. My mind was racing, processing the massive catastrophic intelligence Vivian had just arrogantly handed to me on a silver platter. She thought she was intimidating me. She thought she was proving Desmond's untouchable genius. She did not realize she had just exposed his entire endgame, a $50 million merger with Meridian Global on Friday. I pulled my keyboard toward me and rapidly typed the conglomerate's name into my financial database. Meridian Global was a massive, legitimate corporate entity known for aggressively acquiring regional logistics firms to expand their national footprint. They had no idea they were about to buy a company built on a foundation of money laundering, offshore racketeering, and embezzled church funds. Desmond was not trying to expand his business. He was executing a highly sophisticated exit strategy. Detective Wallace had warned me that Desmond would try to liquidate and run if he sensed the federal authorities closing in. I just had no idea the timeline was this tight or the payout was this massive. Desmond was using the Meridian Global merger to wash $50 million clean in a single legitimate corporate transaction. Once the merger was signed on Friday, Meridian would absorb his domestic roots, and Desmond would liquidate his equity into clean cash. He would dissolve Apex Solutions, wipe the offshore Cayman nodes, and take the money to a non-extradition country. He was trying to cash out and flee before the federal indictments dropped. I looked at the digital calendar on my lower monitor. Today was Tuesday. I had exactly 3 days to stop a $50 million corporate acquisition and dismantle a 30-year criminal empire. Desmond thought he had suffocated me by freezing my bank accounts. He thought Vivian had terrified me into submission. But I was a forensic auditor, and I now possessed the exact timeline, the target buyer, and the encrypted shadow ledger. I grabbed my desk phone and dialed Detective Wallace's direct secure line. It was time to strike the fatal blow. Wallace picked up on the second ring. His voice carried the exhaustion of a man who spent his life chasing ghosts through miles of bureaucratic red tape. I have the endgame, I said, bypassing any greeting. Desmond is not just restructuring, he is cashing out. Meridian Global is acquiring his entire domestic logistics network this Friday for $50 million. Once that ink dries, he liquidates Apex Solutions, wipes the offshore accounts, and catches a private flight to a jurisdiction without an extradition treaty. You have exactly 48 hours before the architect of your racketeering case vanishes permanently. The line was dead silent for a long moment. I could hear the faint sound of sirens through Wallace's receiver. Meridian Global is a clean conglomerate, Wallace finally said, his tone heavy with severe frustration. They are heavily regulated. If Desmond merges with them, that $50 million is washed instantly. It becomes entirely legitimate corporate equity. But Zora, I cannot walk into a federal judge's chamber and demand an injunction to halt a $50 million corporate acquisition based solely on a decrypted handwritten ledger. The ledger perfectly maps the offshore routing nodes, I argued, my voice rising in the quiet office. It proves the genesis of the capital. It proves the embezzlement from Shiloh Community Church. It proves everything. It proves your grandmother was a meticulous record keeper, Wallace countered sharply. But Preston is a high-powered corporate attorney. The moment I present that handwritten book, he will claim it is a sophisticated forgery created by a bitter, estranged daughter trying to extort her grieving family. Chloe's little video performance online has already laid the groundwork for that exact defense. The judge will look at the public narrative, look at the lack of direct digital corroboration, and throw my warrant request straight into the shredder. To stop a merger of this magnitude, I need the unredacted raw server logs from Apex Solutions. I need the digital footprint that matches your grandmother's physical cipher. Without the raw data from Preston's servers, Desmond walks away completely free. Then get a warrant for Apex Solutions, I demanded. Raid Preston's servers. We do not have the probable cause for a digital raid, Zora. The cyber division needs weeks to build a case solid enough to breach a corporate law firm's servers. We cannot just kick down their digital doors based on a hunch and a notebook. If we move without an airtight warrant, the evidence becomes inadmissible in court. We are boxed in. A cold, hard realization settled over me. The federal government was too slow, too bound by protocol, and too terrified of corporate blowback to act in time. Desmond had structured this specifically to exploit those exact weaknesses. He knew the FBI would hesitate to disrupt a massive deal with a clean company like Meridian. If you cannot get the server logs, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, then I will get them for you. Zora, absolutely do not do that. Wallace ordered, his voice instantly shifting from a weary detective to a stern federal agent. If you breach a corporate server without authorization, you are committing a federal cybercrime. You will be looking at hard time. Do not ruin your life over this. We will find another way. There is no other way, Wallace. Friday is the deadline. Have your inbox ready. I ended the call and placed the phone face down on the desk. I did not have weeks. I had less than 2 days to breach a corporate consulting firm, extract the most highly guarded financial secrets of my father's empire, and cross-reference them against Grandma Ruby's ledger. It was an impossible task for a standard auditor. But I was not a standard auditor. I was a woman who had been systematically stripped of her family, her clients, and her financial security. I had been backed into a corner by arrogant men who believed their money made them completely untouchable. I swiveled my chair back to my heavy-duty processing tower. Preston walked around Atlanta wearing $5,000 suits, boasting about the impenetrable security of Apex Solutions. But I knew Preston. I knew his profound laziness. Years ago, during a rare family dinner before the estrangement solidified, Preston had bragged after a few too many glasses of bourbon about how he had streamlined his firm's operational costs by migrating their entire database to a third-party cloud vendor. He had scoffed at the idea of paying a dedicated in-house cybersecurity team. He thought spending money on digital walls was a waste of capital because he believed nobody would ever dare look closely at his books. His arrogance was his absolute greatest vulnerability. I opened a command line interface on my secondary monitor. I was not going to launch a frontal assault on the Apex Solutions firewall. That would immediately trigger automated alarms and lock down the network. Instead, I targeted the third-party vendor Preston had bragged about. I ran a passive reconnaissance script masking my IP address through a rotating series of international proxies. I bounced my connection from Atlanta to servers in Estonia, then through Brazil, and finally routed it back into the United States. To anyone monitoring the Apex network, my probing would look like random automated background noise from the global web. Hours evaporated. The sun sank below the Atlanta skyline, plunging my office into darkness, illuminated only by the harsh clinical glow of my monitors. My eyes burned, and my muscles ached from remaining rigidly frozen in my chair. I survived on black espresso and the pure, unadulterated adrenaline of the hunt. By Thursday morning, I had mapped the external architecture of Preston's cloud storage. Just as I suspected, the vendor had patched their primary vulnerabilities, but Preston had failed to update the administrative credentials for his specific corporate tenant portal in over 3 years. He was using legacy authentication protocols. I initiated a targeted credential stuffing attack utilizing a custom algorithm that cross-referenced Preston's known public data, his anniversary dates, his favorite sports teams, the names of his childhood pets, against common password variations. It was a tedious, grueling process. The software fired thousands of combinations at the login portal, pacing the requests perfectly to avoid triggering a brute force lockout protocol. At exactly 2 in the afternoon on Thursday, the terminal screen flashed green. Authentication accepted. Connection established. I released a breath I felt like I had been holding for hours. I was inside Apex Solutions. I was standing virtually inside the vault of Preston's shell company. I immediately deployed a silent shadow script to mask my presence from the active user logs. I could not afford to let anyone know a ghost was wandering through their filing cabinets. The sheer volume of data housed on the servers was staggering. Preston had hundreds of nested directories, thousands of encrypted PDFs, and endless spreadsheets designed to look like legitimate real estate acquisitions and consulting fees. I did not have the time to manually search through the noise. I opened the digital copy of Grandma Ruby's decoded ledger on my left monitor. I highlighted the specific prime number fluctuations and the offshore routing nodes she had meticulously recorded. I wrote a rapid extraction script feeding Grandma Ruby's cipher keys directly into the search parameters of the Apex database. I instructed the software to bypass the superficial tax returns and dive straight into the raw, unredacted transactional histories. I hit execute. The system hesitated for a fraction of a second before the results began to violently populate across my screen. It was a perfect, devastating match. Every single offshore transfer Desmond had ever made from Cyprus and the Cayman Islands correlated exactly with a domestic deposit hidden within the Apex servers. The embezzled funds from Shiloh Community Church were neatly categorized under a fake commercial property acquisition file. The stolen life insurance payout from my grandfather was listed as initial seed capital from an anonymous angel investor. Preston had built a digital laundry machine, taking the bloody, dirty money of my father's crimes and spinning it into pristine corporate equity. And now I had the raw server logs to prove it. I had the exact digital footprint Detective Wallace needed to secure a federal warrant and halt the Meridian Global merger. I quickly opened a secure encrypted file transfer protocol. I highlighted the entire master directory containing the unredacted routing histories and initiated the massive download. The progress bar appeared on my screen, a thin blue line slowly creeping forward. 10%, 20%. I leaned forward, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. 30%. Suddenly the progress bar halted. The steady hum of my processor pitched upward, whining in severe distress. The entire terminal screen flashed a blinding violent red. A command prompt popped up directly in the center of my monitor, overriding my local controls. System Administrator Override. Unauthorized access detected. My blood turned to ice. Someone was awake on the other side of the connection. Preston, or whoever he had hired to monitor the network ahead of the massive Friday merger, had spotted the massive data pull. My shadow script had held up against the automated alarms, but the sheer size of the extraction had triggered a manual review. They knew I was inside. I frantically typed a command to force the download to continue trying to bypass the administrative block. The blue progress bar ticked up to 35% before stopping permanently. Another red warning banner slashed across my screen, accompanied by lines of rapidly executing code that I was not typing. Critical security protocol initiated. Remote wipe of master directory commencing. Preston was not just kicking me out of the server, he was panicking. He saw that someone was attempting to extract the core routing logs, and he made the immediate desperate decision to burn the entire digital building to the ground. He was initiating a total irreversible wipe of the Apex Solutions database. He was trying to destroy the unredacted evidence before I could pull it through the firewall. I watched in absolute horror as the files in the directory began to vanish one by one. The evidence of the church embezzlement, the proof of the life insurance theft. It was all evaporating into digital dust. I slammed my hands onto the keyboard, launching a desperate countermeasure to lock the directory and pull the remaining files into my local drive. The screen turned into a chaotic battlefield of overlapping command prompts. It was a digital tug-of-war. Preston was burning the evidence from the inside, and I was desperately trying to drag it out into the light before it turned to ash. The red warning banners multiplied across my monitors, casting a harsh, bloody glow over my dining room. Preston was on the other side of the digital wall, and he was panicking. I could practically see him in his lavish, mahogany-paneled office, sweating through his custom-tailored suit as he mashed his keyboard. He had realized a foreign entity was deep inside his secure cloud server, actively draining the unredacted routing logs of his precious shell companies. His response was as brutal as it was unrefined. He was initiating a remote wipe, attempting to burn the entire Apex Solutions database to ash before I could extract the proof of my father's criminal empire. I watched the command lines cascade down my screen. Files were disappearing. Decades of meticulously hidden money laundering data, the very lifeblood of Desmond's impending $50 million merger, were being reallocated into digital nothingness. Preston was executing a scorched earth protocol. He figured it was better to destroy his own firm's operational data than let the federal government see the raw numbers. But Preston was a lawyer, not a forensic data engineer. He bought his security off the shelf, trusting expensive third-party vendors to do the heavy lifting. He operated under the arrogant assumption that a deletion command instantly erased a file from existence. I had spent my entire professional life hunting people exactly like him. I knew how cloud architecture actually functioned. When a user triggers a massive deletion protocol on a commercial server, the system does not immediately overwrite the magnetic sectors of the physical hard drives. That process requires too much processing power and time. Instead, the server simply deletes the index pathways. It severs the digital roadmaps leading to the files, rendering them invisible to the standard user interface, while the actual data remains perfectly intact in the server's unallocated space until it is eventually overwritten by new data. Preston was locking the front doors and tearing up the map, completely unaware that I was already crawling through the foundation. I did not waste a single second trying to fight his administrative override. I let him think he was winning. I immediately killed my primary extraction script, dropping my connection to the main user interface. The sudden cessation of my download would look like a successful defensive block on his end. I imagined Preston letting out a massive sigh of relief, leaning back in his chair, believing he had successfully severed the hostile connection and protected Desmond's merger. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard. I launched a secondary backdoor protocol I had kept dormant for exactly this scenario. I bypassed the user authentication portal entirely and targeted the server's temporary cache memory. The server was currently utilizing a massive amount of RAM to process Preston's frantic deletion commands. I slipped my shadow script directly into that processing stream. I was no longer asking the server for the files. I was commanding the server to mirror its physical sector data directly to my local drive before the reallocation process could overwrite it. My terminal screen shifted from aggressive red to a cool, steady green. A new progress bar appeared tracking the raw sector clone. I watched the numbers tick upward, my heart hammering a violent rhythm against my ribs. Preston's deletion protocol was actively chewing through the directory, but my mirroring script was moving just fractions of a second faster, copying the data from the unallocated space exactly as he unlinked it. It was a high-stakes digital foot race occurring in the invisible background of the web. He was throwing the files into the fire, and I was snatching them out of the flames. 40%, 50%. The cooling fans on my heavy-duty processing tower roared, pushing out waves of hot air as the CPU maxed out its capacity. I leaned forward, my eyes locked relentlessly on the scrolling green text. I could see the fragments of data pulling through the breach, the Cayman Island routing nodes, the dummy invoices used to wash the stolen life insurance payout. The continuous, agonizingly clear wire transfers siphoned directly from the Shiloh Community Church Building Fund. It was all there, pristine and completely unredacted. 70%, 80%. Suddenly, the data stream stuttered. The flow of information slowed to a crawl. Preston had realized the deletion was taking too long. He had realized the server processing load was entirely too high for a standard file purge. He was escalating his response. He was no longer trying to delete the files. He was going for a hard hardware kill. He was attempting to manually sever the connection between the cloud vendor and the Apex network. 85%, 90%. My hands gripped the edge of the desk, every muscle in my body pulled taut. The green progress bar hitched again, freezing for a terrifying 3 seconds. Come on, I whispered to the glowing monitors. 95%. 98%. A harsh mechanical tone blasted from my computer speakers. The connection dropped. The screens went completely black. The silence in my dining room was absolute, save for the heavy, labored breathing escaping my own lungs. I stared at the dark monitors, a cold wave of dread washing over me. If the connection severed before the final checksum validation completed, the entire data packet would corrupt. The files would be unreadable. All the proof, all the evidence of Desmond's 30-year reign of theft would be useless digital garbage. I reached out with a trembling hand and tapped the spacebar. The monitors flickered back to life. My local decryption software booted up, scanning the downloaded payload. A loading circle spun in the center of the screen, analyzing the raw sector data. The seconds stretched into eternity. I held my breath, my eyes unblinking. The circle vanished. A clean, perfectly structured file directory appeared on my desktop. Validation complete, payload secured. I let out a sharp, breathless laugh, falling back into my leather chair. I had it. I had the complete, unredacted shadow ledger. I opened the primary folder, verifying the contents. I saw Desmond's digital signatures on the transfer authorizations. I saw Preston's internal emails instructing his accountants to mask the church funds under fictitious real estate acquisitions. It was the ultimate smoking gun. It was the exact, undeniable proof required to dismantle the Meridian Global merger and send my father and brother to federal prison. I did not hesitate. I grabbed my phone and dialed Detective Wallace's secure line. I paced the length of my dining room, the adrenaline still coursing violently through my veins as the phone rang. Wallace picked up on the third ring. "What happened?" he demanded immediately. "Did you get it?" "I got everything," I said, a fierce, triumphant edge sharpening my voice. "I have the unredacted server logs from Apex Solutions. I have the digital footprint matching Grandma Ruby's ledger perfectly, the church funds, the Cayman accounts, the life insurance theft. I have Desmond's direct authorization signatures. Preston tried to burn the server, but I cloned the directories from the back door. The evidence is pristine. I am sending the encrypted packet to your drop file right now. You have your probable cause. Go get your warrant and stop that merger." There was a heavy, suffocating silence on the other end of the line. It was not the silence of a detective who had just been handed the crowning achievement of his career. It was the silence of a man staring at a brick wall. Zora Wallace finally said, his voice thick with a profound, bitter exhaustion. "You did incredible work. This evidence is flawless. But it is not going to stop the merger on Friday." I stopped pacing. The triumphant high evaporated instantly, replaced by a sharp, cold confusion. "What are you talking about?" I demanded. "You told me you needed the digital proof. You told me you needed the unredacted logs to bypass Preston's forgery defense. I just handed you the entire criminal enterprise on a silver platter. Take it to a judge." "I can take it to a judge," Wallace replied, his tone grim. "But the duty judge for federal financial injunctions in the Northern District this week is Judge Harold Vance." The name hit me like a physical blow. Judge Vance was a permanent fixture at my parents' extravagant dinner parties. He played 18 holes with Desmond every other Sunday at the country club. He was a cornerstone of the Atlanta elite, deeply entrenched in the exact social circles my father had spent 30 years buying his way into. "Vance is not going to throw the evidence out," Wallace continued, sounding utterly defeated. "He is too smart for that. But he knows exactly how to protect his friends. He will order a preliminary review of the digital acquisition methods. He will request a cyber forensics hearing to validate the integrity of your server breach before he issues the injunction. He will drown the warrant request in procedural bureaucracy. The review process will take at least 72 hours. "The merger signs on Friday morning," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "That is less than 48 hours from now." "Exactly," Wallace said. "Vance will legally stall the warrant just long enough for the Meridian Global ink to dry. By the time I get the injunction approved on Monday, Desmond will have already liquidated his assets. The $50 million will be washed into untraceable offshore accounts, and your father will be on a private jet to a country that does not extradite financial criminals. The legal system is too slow, Zora. Desmond factored the bureaucratic delay into his timeline. We cannot stop the wire transfer from the inside. I stood perfectly still in the center of my dark brownstone. My family had weaponized the very system designed to hold them accountable. They had bought the judges, manipulated the timelines, and insulated themselves in a fortress of corporate legitimacy. Desmond was going to get away with stealing Grandma Ruby's future. He was going to get away with robbing his own community. He was going to take $50 million of clean corporate money and vanish, leaving me behind to bear the absolute destruction of my career and my reputation. If the law cannot stop him in time, I said, the cold clarity returning to my mind, reshaping my strategy, then the law is no longer useful to me. Zora, do not do anything reckless, Wallace warned, a sudden urgency in his voice. We will build a longer case. We will track the funds. There is no longer case, I replied, my voice completely devoid of panic. Meridian Global is a publicly traded national conglomerate. They are terrified of bad press. They survive on shareholder trust and clean corporate optics. They are buying Desmond's logistics network because they believe it is a pristine, highly profitable asset. If they find out they are purchasing a criminal enterprise built on embezzled church funds, they will not wait for a federal judge to issue an injunction. They will sprint for the exit. What are you planning? Wallace asked, the tension radiating through the receiver. Desmond wants to finalize this deal with a massive, triumphant media event, I said, walking back to my desk and staring at the digital files on my screen. He is hosting the signing ceremony at the Apex Solutions downtown headquarters tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. He wants the cameras there. He wants the Atlanta business elite watching him conquer the national market. I picked up the heavy, laser-cut black tier key from my desk, slipping it into my pocket. If the federal courts are too slow to execute the drop, I said, my voice as hard and sharp as cut glass, then I am going to execute it myself. I am going to walk right into that signing ceremony tomorrow morning, and I am going to burn his empire to the ground in front of everyone. The grand ballroom of the St. Regis was a suffocating monument to Desmond's ego. He had draped the massive space in gold and cream, 30 years of corporate deceit masquerading as an anniversary gala. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, glittering light over hundreds of Atlanta's most influential figures. State senators, real estate developers, and the deeply pious leaders of Shiloh Community Church were all gathered around tables adorned with towering white orchids. Waiters in pristine tuxedos glided through the room, carrying silver trays of champagne, completely unaware that they were serving drinks at a crime scene. Desmond had moved the official signing of the Meridian Global merger to serve as the grand finale of the evening. He wanted maximum exposure. He wanted the cameras flashing, the crowd cheering, and the Atlanta business elite watching as he cemented his legacy and transitioned his dirty logistics network into $50 million of untraceable corporate capital. I stood in the shadows of the grand foyer watching the spectacle through the massive double doors. I was not wearing my usual muted office attire. I wore a custom-tailored floor-length gown in a sharp, structured midnight blue. The silk armor fit me perfectly, projecting an image of absolute unyielding power. I had spent my entire life shrinking into the background to avoid Desmond's towering shadow. Tonight I was going to eclipse it entirely. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the heavy weight of the encrypted flash drive in my clutch. I stepped into the light, pushing the heavy mahogany doors open, and walked directly into the ballroom. My entrance did not immediately stop the party, but it sent a visible ripple through the crowd near the back of the room. Heads turned. Whispers started. I kept my posture rigid and my gaze locked entirely on the main stage at the front of the ballroom. I moved with a slow, predatory grace, my heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor between the carpeted dining sections. Chloe was the first to spot me. She was standing near the front VIP tables wearing a glittering sequined dress, laughing loudly with a group of Meridian executives' wives. I watched her smile, freeze, her eyes widening in absolute horror as she grabbed Preston's arm. Preston spun around. His face flushed a dark, violent shade of red the moment he saw me approaching the front of the room. He whispered something urgent to Chloe, detached himself from the executives, and moved quickly to intercept me. He flagged down two broad-shouldered private security guards Desmond had hired for the event, gesturing frantically in my direction. "What the hell do you think you are doing here?" Preston hissed, stepping directly into my path to block my access to the center aisle. He leaned in close, his breath reeking of expensive bourbon and panic. "You are not on the guest list, Zora. Turn around and walk out the door right now, or I will have you physically thrown out into the street." I stopped looking at my brother with a cold, absolute indifference that made him physically recoil. "You are sweating, Preston," I noted calmly. "It is ruining your suit." Preston signaled the two security guards who stepped up behind him. "Get this glorified bookkeeper out of here," he ordered, his voice trembling with barely suppressed rage. "She is trespassing." The guard stepped forward, reaching out to grab my arms. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply locked eyes with the older guard and spoke with absolute terrifying authority. "I am Desmond's daughter, and I am scheduled to present the final financial audit to the Meridian Global executives in exactly 2 minutes," I said, my voice cutting through the ambient noise of the ballroom like a razor. "If you put your hands on me and disrupt this $50 million merger, you will not just be fired. I will personally ensure you are named as co-conspirators in the federal racketeering indictment dropping on Monday." The guard froze, his hand hovering inches from my arm. He looked at me, taking in the designer gown, the absolute certainty in my eyes, and the sheer hostility radiating from Preston. In the corporate world, private security knew better than to physically intervene in high-stakes executive family disputes without direct confirmation from the primary boss. The guard took a slow step back, lowering his hands. Preston's mouth fell open in disbelief. "Grab her!" he sputtered, looking frantically at the guards. "I gave you a direct order." But the momentum was already mine. I stepped around Preston, using my shoulder to brush past him effortlessly. He stumbled back against a cocktail table, knocking over a tray of champagne glasses. The shattering crystal drew the attention of the entire front row, including Pastor Miller from Shiloh Community Church, who looked up with mild confusion. I walked straight down the center aisle toward the main stage. Desmond stood at the grand acrylic podium. He was beaming, soaking in the adulation of the crowd. To his right stood the CEO of Meridian Global, a tall, distinguished man holding a leather-bound contract. Between them rested the final merger agreement, illuminated by a spotlight. Desmond was mid-sentence, waxing poetic about his humble beginnings, his deep faith, and the grueling sacrifices he had made to build a logistics empire from the ground up. He raised a heavy gold fountain pen, holding it aloft for the photographer kneeling at the base of the stage. The flashbulbs erupted in a blinding strobe effect. Desmond lowered the pen toward the signature line, preparing to finalize the $50 million cash out. I ascended the short flight of stairs on the left side of the stage. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of my heels echoed through the microphone feed, amplified across the massive ballroom. Desmond froze. The gold pen halted a fraction of an inch above the thick paper. He slowly turned his head, his charismatic smile morphing into an expression of sheer, unadulterated terror as he recognized the woman stepping onto his stage. For a split second, the ballroom was dead silent. The clinking of glasses ceased. The low murmur of conversation vanished entirely. Hundreds of people stared up at the stage, watching a confrontation they did not yet understand. Vivian leaped up from her seat in the front row, her chair scraping violently against the floor. "Zora," she shrieked, abandoning all pretense of high society decorum. "Stop right there, security." I ignored her completely. I walked directly up to the acrylic podium, stepping squarely into Desmond's personal space. He opened his mouth to speak, to charm his way out of the situation, to command me to leave, but the words died in his throat. He saw the cold, dead certainty in my eyes. He knew exactly why I was there. I reached out and smoothly pulled the microphone away from him. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with a lethal, measured calm that projected flawlessly through the sound system, reverberating off the gold-draped walls of the grand ballroom. "My father loves preaching to this community about building generational wealth," I said, staring directly out at the sea of shocked faces. "He loves telling the story of the self-made man, the dedicated son, the devoted church leader who built an empire out of nothing but grit and faith." I paused, letting the silence stretch, locking eyes with Pastor Miller in the front row. Let us show everyone exactly whose wealth he built it with. I reached into my clutch and retrieved the silver flash drive. The podium was equipped with a master presentation laptop, currently displaying a massive high-definition slide of the Apex Solutions corporate logo on the twin 50-foot projection screens flanking the stage. I stepped past Desmond, who was completely paralyzed by shock, and jammed the flash drive directly into the laptop's USB port. I executed the auto-run script I had coded hours earlier. The software instantly overrode the hotel's presentation system, hijacking the dual screens. The Apex Solutions logo vanished. The screens went black for a fraction of a second before exploding into a blinding array of raw, unredacted financial data. On the left screen, Grandma Ruby's handwritten ledger appeared, her faded blue ink magnified to massive proportions, displaying the date of my grandfather's death and the exact routing numbers she had so cleverly hidden. On the right screen, the unredacted digital server logs from Apex Solutions scrolled rapidly, locking perfectly onto the Cayman Island offshore accounts. A collective gasp echoed through the ballroom as I hit the next command. The screens shifted, highlighting the exact foundational deposit that launched Desmond's company. The text was massive, undeniable, and verified by the corporate banking seal. It clearly showed the entire life insurance payout meant for his grieving mother being intercepted and wired to a shell company in Cyprus. But I was not done. I tapped the keyboard again, bringing up the Shiloh Community Church embezzlement logs. The 50-foot screens split into two distinct columns. On the left side, the public fundraising records from Shiloh Community Church were displayed, showing hundreds of thousands of dollars donated by the congregation for a youth center. On the right side, the Apex Solutions internal transfer logs glowed bright red, showing those exact funds being systematically drained dollar for dollar into Preston's hidden corporate accounts, labeled as fictitious real estate acquisitions. The ballroom descended into absolute chaos. Pastor Miller stood up, his face drained of all color, staring at the screen in pure horror. The congregation members scattered throughout the crowd began shouting, pointing at the irrefutable proof of their stolen savings. The wives of the politicians covered their mouths, backing away from the VIP tables. The CEO of Meridian Global looked at the screens, looked at the banking logs, and then looked down at the contract on the podium. His face hardened into a mask of corporate fury. He dropped his pen on the table, snatched the merger agreement, and immediately signaled his executive team to leave the stage. The $50 million deal was dead. Desmond stood beside me, physically shaking his breath, coming in shallow, panicked, ragged gasps. The empire he had spent 30 years building on the backs of his own mother and his own community was burning to the ground in front of a live audience. He had tried to starve me out. He had tried to erase my existence to protect his money. I turned to him, the glow of the massive projection screens illuminating the total destruction of his legacy. I pulled the flash drive from the laptop, dropping it onto the contract table. I believe the audit is officially concluded, I said. The 50-foot projection screens flanking the main stage continued to broadcast the undeniable, devastating proof of a 30-year criminal enterprise. The bright high-definition displays illuminated the cavernous gold-draped ballroom with the harsh, glowing reality of massive financial fraud. I stood completely still at the acrylic podium, watching the unredacted digital logs from Apex Solutions synchronize perfectly with the scanned pages of Grandma Ruby's weathered leather ledger. The domestic transfers, siphoned directly from the Shiloh Community Church Building Fund, were cross-referenced in real time with the offshore routing nodes located in the Cayman Islands and Cyprus. The exact dollar amounts down to the very last decimal point flowed across the screens in a violently undeniable stream of evidence, proving that my father had constructed his entire logistics empire on a foundation of stolen money and profound betrayal. The silence that had initially gripped the St. Regis ballroom shattered into a million pieces of absolute chaos. The sheer magnitude of the financial crimes displayed on those massive projection screens was impossible for anyone to ignore. The CEO of Meridian Global, A man whose entire prestigious career was built on aggressively mitigating corporate risk stared at the decrypted routing logs linking Desmond's logistics network to the Cayman Islands. The blood drained from his face completely. He looked down at the $50 million merger contract resting on the acrylic podium, then back up at the glowing screens. He did not ask my father for an explanation. He did not demand an apology. He simply dropped the heavy gold fountain pen onto the table. The pen clattered loudly against the polished wood, a sharp metallic sound that signaled the definitive death of a $50 million acquisition. The CEO snatched the heavy leather-bound merger agreement, gripped it firmly in both hands, and ripped the signature pages straight down the middle. He tossed the shredded contract onto the stage floor, turned his back on my father, and signaled his executive legal team. They moved in a tight protective formation fast, walking down the side aisle toward the emergency exits, completely abandoning the doomed acquisition. The massive cash-out Desmond had orchestrated to fund his international escape evaporated into thin air. Down in the audience, the true gravity of the situation was violently settling in. Reverend Jackson of Shiloh Community Church was on his feet, his hands trembling as he pointed at the screen, displaying the exact amounts siphoned from the Youth Center Building Fund. Church elders who had prayed with my father, who had trusted him to steward their community savings, were shouting in disbelief and profound grief. The local politicians and wealthy elite, who had spent the evening sipping expensive champagne and toasting Desmond's manufactured legacy, were now recoiling in sheer panic. They were scrambling for the exits, terrified that their mere presence at this gala would implicate them in a federal racketeering scandal. But no one was leaving this ballroom. Above the frantic shouting and the sound of overturning chairs, a new noise pierced the heavy atmosphere of the hotel. It started as a distant, high-pitched wail, but it grew louder and more aggressive by the second. The sound of dozens of police sirens converged on the luxury hotel, echoing off the surrounding downtown high-rises. Red and blue emergency lights began strobing violently through the sheer drapes covering the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, painting the gold and cream decor in the harsh, frantic colors of law enforcement. Desmond snapped out of his paralyzed state. The reality of the sirens cut through his arrogant delusion, overriding his shock with pure primal desperation. The $50 million lifeline he needed to escape the country was gone. His reputation was incinerated. He looked wildly around the room, his eyes wide and frantic, realizing the federal government had finally caught up to him. He spun away from the podium, abandoning the stage entirely. He leaped down the side stairs, shoving past a terrified waiter and knocking a towering silver tray of champagne glasses to the floor in a desperate, pathetic bid to reach the service kitchen exit. He did not make it 5 steps. The heavy mahogany doors at the main entrance of the ballroom burst open with explosive, thunderous force. Detective Wallace strode into the venue flanked by a massive tactical unit of federal agents wearing dark windbreakers emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. They poured into the room with ruthless military precision, immediately fanning out across the perimeter to lock down every single exit point and seal the room. "Nobody moves!" Wallace roared, his voice booming over the chaos through a portable bullhorn, bringing the frantic, shoving crowd to a stunned, terrified halt. "Keep your hands where we can see them. Secure the stage. Lock the doors." 2 federal agents intercepted Desmond's escape route instantly. They closed the distance before my father could even register their presence. One agent grabbed Desmond by the shoulder of his custom-tailored tuxedo, utilizing his own desperate momentum against him. They drove him brutally forward, slamming him face first into the gold-draped wall beside the catering station. The impact rattled the decorative fixtures. Desmond groaned as the air was knocked from his lungs, his cheek pressed roughly against the expensive wallpaper. The agents kicked his legs apart, violently wrenching his arms behind his back. "Get your hands off me," Desmond bellowed, struggling pointlessly against the seasoned federal officers. "I am a pillar of this community. I built this city. You have absolutely no right to touch me." "You have the right to remain silent," Detective Wallace countered, striding down the center aisle toward the commotion. Though considering the overwhelming financial data currently projected onto those screens for the entire Northern District of Georgia to see, I highly doubt silence is going to save you now, Desmond. You are under arrest for federal racketeering, wire fraud, grand larceny, and tax evasion. The sharp, unmistakable metallic ratcheting sound of heavy steel handcuffs echoing across the room was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire life. The untouchable corporate titan, the man who had mocked me at a graveside and attempted to starve me out of my own business, was now pinned to a wall like a common street criminal. Down in the front row, the reality of the federal raid was finally penetrating Preston's thick skull. He watched his father-in-law get aggressively handcuffed. He watched the federal agents securing the building. He realized the shell companies he had managed, the offshore accounts he had hidden, were all completely exposed. The arrogant, condescending white corporate lawyer who had stood on my front porch and threatened to litigate me into homelessness just 48 hours ago completely unraveled. His perfectly styled hair was disheveled, sweat was pouring down his pale face, and the smug color had entirely drained from his skin. He threw his hands straight up into the air, his palms flat and open, showing he was completely unarmed. He stepped away from Chloe, putting immediate, cowardly physical distance between himself and the family he had married into. He walked briskly toward Detective Wallace, his voice cracking with sheer, pathetic terror. "Officer, wait!" Preston screamed over the ambient noise of the crowd, desperately trying to project a tone of innocent cooperation. "Listen to me. I had absolutely nothing to do with the church embezzlement. I am just a consultant. I am external legal counsel for the logistics network." Desmond compartmentalized the operations. He lied to me about the source of the capital. I was given falsified ledgers. I am a victim of his fraud. Desmond forced me to structure the accounts. I am cooperating fully with the federal government. I invoke attorney-client privilege, and I am requesting immediate immunity as a cooperating witness. I will testify against him right now. He was throwing his own father-in-law under the bus with breathtaking speed, sacrificing his family in a frantic, spineless bid to save his own skin. I stepped down from the short flight of stairs from the stage, the midnight blue silk of my custom gown brushing softly against the carpet. I walked calmly and deliberately down the center aisle, the crowd parting for me as I approached Detective Wallace and the groveling corporate lawyer. I did not rush. I carried myself with the absolute unyielding calm of a woman who had already won the war. I reached into the hidden pocket of my dress and pulled out a bright red, heavily encrypted flash drive. I had intentionally separated the raw data, ensuring the specific files detailing the offshore routing structure were instantly accessible for exactly this moment. I stopped right beside Preston, who was still holding his hands in the air, trembling visibly. I offered him a calm, serene smile that made his breath hitch in his throat. "Consultants give advice, Preston," I said, keeping my voice low, steady, and utterly lethal. "Architects build the house. You should really check your own metadata before you try to lie to a federal agent." I handed the red flash drive directly to Detective Wallace, maintaining intense, unwavering eye contact with my brother-in-law. "This drive contains the complete, unredacted internal communications from Apex Solutions Y," stated, clearly projecting my voice so the surrounding agents heard every single word. "Inside, you will find 72 highly detailed emails sent directly from Preston's private corporate account. They explicitly outline the exact offshore proxy routes he personally engineered to wash the embezzled church funds. He did not just consult on the operation, he authorized the creation of the shell companies. He masterminded the entire domestic laundering architecture to bypass federal tax laws and protect Desmond's logistics empire." Preston's mouth fell completely slack. He stared at the red flash drive resting in Wallace's palm, the absolute devastation of his life crashing down upon him. He tried to speak, to formulate some desperate legal defense, but no sound escaped his throat. He realized in that agonizing second that I had completely bypassed his frantic remote server wipe and secured the definitive, undeniable proof of his criminal complicity. Wallace did not even need to plug the drive into a terminal. He looked at Preston, an expression of profound, satisfied disgust settling over his hardened features. He gave a sharp, definitive nod to the two federal agents standing directly behind the lawyer. "Bag him," Wallace ordered. The agents moved with brutal efficiency. They grabbed Preston by the elbows, forcefully yanking his arms down from their surrender posture and twisting them aggressively behind his back. Preston did not fight. He did not yell about his rights or demand to call his partners. He simply hung his head, his shoulders shaking as he sobbed quietly. The heavy steel cuffs locked tightly around his wrists. The agents marched him roughly toward the front of the room, forcing him to stand right next to his disgraced father-in-law against the wall. The two men who had controlled my family through intimidation, stolen wealth, and arrogant manipulation were now standing side by side in federal custody, completely stripped of their power and their dignity. A sharp, hysterical, and deeply guttural wail tore through the heavy atmosphere of the ballroom. My mother Vivian had collapsed in the center of the VIP section. She sank heavily onto her knees, her pristine, custom-tailored white couture dress pooling around her in a mixture of spilled champagne and broken crystal. She covered her face with her hands, weeping with a violent, dramatic intensity. But she was not crying for the husband currently being read his Miranda rights. She was not crying for the son-in-law being hauled away in steel bracelets. She was not crying for the elderly church members her husband had systematically robbed. She was weeping for the absolute, irreversible destruction of her social standing. "My reputation," Vivian sobbed wildly, rocking back and forth on the marble floor as she clutched the heavy string of pearls around her neck. Reverend Jackson was right there. The entire congregation saw everything. "We are ruined. We are completely destroyed. The country club will revoke our memberships. The charity boards will banish us. How will I ever show my face in this city again?" Chloe stood completely paralyzed beside her mother. The golden child who had spent her entire 32 years floating on a soft cloud of stolen wealth and unearned entitlement finally realized she was in free fall without a parachute. She looked at the projection screens displaying the frozen Cayman accounts, then looked at Preston standing in handcuffs. The reality of her impending poverty hit her with physical force. She realized that the frozen accounts meant her trust funds, her unlimited platinum credit cards, her luxury vehicles, and her designer lifestyle were evaporating into thin air in real time. She snapped her gaze toward me, her eyes wild with a mixture of sheer terror and unhinged fury. "You did this!" Chloe screamed, her voice shrill and raw. "You took everything from us. My trust fund is gone. My husband is going to prison. You ruined my life, Zora. You are a monster. You are nothing but a bitter, vindictive failure who wanted to destroy us because you were jealous." I looked down at the two women kneeling in the wreckage of their fake empire. I felt absolutely no pity for them. I felt no remorse for exposing the truth. I felt only the clean, sharp, profound edge of absolute justice. They had actively participated in the emotional abuse that drove me away from my family. They had gleefully benefited from the theft of my grandfather's life insurance and the robbery of their own community. They had tried to starve me out financially and destroy my professional reputation simply to protect their stolen wealth. I took 2 deliberate steps toward them, looking down at my mother and my sister with utter, unbreakable composure. "Grandma Ruby gave you 30 years to do the right thing," I said, my voice quiet but carrying the heavy, resonant weight of absolute finality. "She sat in the corner of your lavish parties watching you steal and lie, hoping you would eventually find some shred of morality. You failed her. I did not steal your future, Chloe. I just finished the job." I did not wait for them to respond. I turned my back on my family for the final time and walked toward the heavy mahogany doors of the ballroom. The federal agents parted seamlessly to let me through. Detective Wallace gave me a single respectful nod of acknowledgement as I passed. I did not look back at the gold-draped room, the flashing police lights, or the crumbling remains of my father's empire. I walked out into the cool Atlanta night, feeling the heavy, suffocating weight of my family's toxic legacy lift from my shoulders entirely. Flash forward 6 months. The dust from the massive federal indictment had finally settled over the Atlanta business community. The collapse of Desmond's logistics network made national headlines hailed by financial journalists as one of the most complex corporate fraud takedowns in Georgia history. Confronted with the unredacted server logs and the decrypted shadow ledger, Desmond and Preston had absolutely no viable legal defense. They both opted to plead guilty to multiple counts of federal racketeering, wire fraud, and international money laundering to avoid the humiliation of a drawn-out, highly publicized trial. They were currently serving mandatory 20-year sentences in a maximum security federal penitentiary, completely stripped of their assets, their influence, and their dignity. The fallout for Vivian and Chloe was equally devastating, though entirely legal. The federal government seized all properties and liquid assets tied to the illicit funds under civil forfeiture laws. This included Vivian's sprawling suburban estate, Chloe's luxury Buckhead condo, and all their offshore trust accounts. Stripped of her wealth and her social standing, Vivian had retreated to a small, modest rented apartment on the outskirts of the city. She was completely ostracized by the elite church community and the country club associates she had spent her entire life trying to impress. Chloe's reality had fractured the hardest. Without the stolen trust funds and the fake corporate titles her father had provided, she was forced to confront the absolute lack of any practical skills on her resume. Completely cut off from the frozen assets, the former golden child of the family was working a minimum wage retail job at a suburban outdoor mall. She was taking the public bus to work every morning because the federal government had repossessed her leased Mercedes, forcing her to finally learn the true value of a hard-earned dollar. As for me, my life had profoundly transformed. Following the federal seizure, the courts recognized the legitimacy of Grandma Ruby's original trust and the life insurance payout that had been stolen from her. Because my forensic accounting firm possessed the necessary expertise and had actively aided the federal investigation, the court officially appointed me to serve as the primary receivership entity to manage the reclaimed legitimate assets of my grandmother's estate. I spent months meticulously untangling Preston's offshore routes, identifying every stolen dollar, and systematically returning the funds to their rightful owners. Shiloh Community Church received their entire stolen building fund back, plus 30 years of calculated compounded interest. Reverend Jackson had wept when I handed him the finalized transfer documents. The community youth center they had dreamed of for decades was finally breaking ground. I did not keep the remaining reclaimed wealth for myself. I did not need it. My forensic accounting firm was thriving, my client list expanding rapidly in the wake of the high-profile federal case, as corporations sought out an auditor with an uncorrupted, ironclad ethical reputation. I had my own wealth built entirely on my own merit and hard work. Instead, I used Grandma Ruby's reclaimed funds to establish a massive, fully funded community grant program. The initiative was designed exclusively to provide operational seed capital, university scholarships, and high-level mentorship to young aspiring African American women entering the fields of technology, cybersecurity, and forensic finance. I was building a system designed to empower the very people Desmond had spent his life stepping on. I was ensuring that Grandma Ruby's true legacy, one of sharp observation, quiet strength, and unwavering justice, would endure for generations to come. I stood on the wide wrap-around porch of my historic brownstone on a crisp, bright Friday morning. The early sun cast long golden shadows across my quiet, tree-lined street. I wore comfortable sweatpants and an oversized college hoodie. I held a steaming mug of dark roast coffee in both hands, watching the city slowly wake up around me. My phone was silent. There were no frantic text messages, no arrogant legal threats, no toxic family members trying to diminish my worth or manipulate my emotions. I took a slow sip of the coffee, looking out at the city I loved, feeling a profound, quiet peace settle over my spirit. My family had tried to bury me. They had called me a parasitic embarrassment, a failure, an ugly college dropout who would never amount to anything. They had assumed that because I rejected their toxic definition of success, I was entirely powerless. They were wrong. I had not just survived their intimidation and betrayal. I had bypassed their financial sabotage, uncovered their darkest secrets, and completely dismantled their entire criminal existence. I had climbed down into the mud, retrieved the truth, and used it to burn their fake empire to the ground. I had finally forged a true, unbreakable legacy out of the ashes of their deceit, and the view from the top of my own empire was absolutely beautiful. True strength is never defined by those who try to keep you in the shadows. Zora's journey teaches us that when toxic family members attempt to diminish your worth, the most powerful response is not to shrink, but to stand firmly in your truth. Blood does not excuse manipulation, and you are not obligated to protect a legacy built on deceit. Real wealth is found in your integrity, independence, and the courage to forge your own path. When others refuse to give you a seat at the table, you have the ultimate power to build your own empire. If you have ever had to break free from toxic family expectations to forge your own path to success, share your story in the comments below and subscribe for more empowering journeys of resilience and triumph.